Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm, and you are watching What If Naruto Was Blessed by a God Far Older Than Kami. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Now, wasting no time, let's start the story.
The typically sunny and warm village of Konoha experienced chilly temperatures and a lot of rain during the winter. We find a little blonde child shivering during a particularly intense downpour, covered only by what might be called rags because they were too ripped to be real clothes. The child in question was Naruto Uzumaki, the son of Yondaime Hokage Minato Namikaze and his wife Kushina Uzumaki, and Jinchuriki to the fabled Biju the Kyuubi no Kitsune. However, the child was unaware of this and didn't seem to care. He had wondered who his parents were and why they had abandoned him for many nights and waking hours, but he quickly came to the conclusion that no one would be able to respond to that query, and the time he was wasting pondering such matters could have been used to find a place to spend the night or scrounge up some food. In order to survive the difficult life of being both an orphan and a social outcast in his hometown, the child, who was only 6 years old, was mentally already in his teens. He had also spent many hours wondering why his own people treated him like he didn't exist, as if he were no more than the dirt they tread on, and why they looked at him with such contempt. However, he had reached the same conclusion regarding his parents. He wasted time because no one would respond to his inquiries. It's better to spend time surviving. However, he was thinking about how he would survive this specific storm tonight. He had been housed in the orphanage during the previous winters, but in the fall, on his birthday, the matron decided to kick him out of their care and leave him to fend for himself on the streets. He had seen this before. It was only while he was asleep that he was truly at the orphanage. Apart from that, he was out on the streets doing whatever he felt like doing at the time. But when winter arrived, he was left without a sturdy roof to protect him from becoming completely soaked for some strange reason. He had never been ill, so he wasn't too concerned about falling ill. He never had a runny nose and was always healthy, even when the orphanage's kids were overrun by fever or chickenpox. However, that was the garden variety of illness. He had no idea how well his body would fare after being exposed to the icy winds of this storm and soaked to the bone by freezing cold water that felt like needles piercing his skin. He had fled into the forest that covered a sizable portion of the land in the center of Konoha in an attempt to find some cover. In an attempt to distract himself from the grimness of his circumstances, Naruto allowed his thoughts to wander to his treatment at the hands of the villagers and his parents while he was shivering, cold, and concealed inside a hollowed-out tree trunk. Those thoughts were interrupted by a burst of thunder. Interesting. Cast out by your own people, treated worse than the dirt they step on, and abandoned by the two people who gave you life. Yet you persevere. You refuse to lay down and die, determined to continue living, came a smooth yet raspy voice. Naruto's eyes shifted to the tree's entrance. The source of the voice. There was a man in a nice black suit, arms crossed, cloaked in an inky black aura, literally floating above the ground. The man himself appeared rather intimidating, and his hair was a short, oily black color. Naruto was both frightened and mesmerized by the man's eyes. There were two pools of what appeared to be endless darkness, similar to the darkness that enveloped the man, but there was no pupil. You pique my curiosity, Naruto Uzumaki, the man said once more. Upon hearing his name, Naruto was taken aback and said, "How do you know my name?" "The same way I know the name of your Hokage, of all your Hokages. The same way I know the name of the woman who kicked you out of the orphanage," the man responded vaguely. Who are you?" A somewhat alarmed Naruto inquired. This man was giving off a very unwelcoming vibe. Actually, the moment Naruto saw him, his whole being had been yelling at him to flee as quickly as possible. "My name has long since been lost by your people. Where I once had hundreds who worshipped me, I have since been replaced by those you call kami, but when I was worshipped they called me the outsider." Desperate to escape this outsider, Naruto asked, "What do you want from me?" "Like I said, you interest me, Naruto Uzumaki. I can see the paths of every man, woman, and child and the decisions that will lead up to those paths. Yet when I look at you, from you come so many different paths, and because of you so many other paths and destinies will be changed," the outsider replied in a monotone voice. Naruto shakily questioned, "What does that even mean? And what does it have to do with you?" "Simple. I wish to give you a gift that has not been seen by your world for several millennia. Use my gift as you see fit. Find the ruins of my shrines spread across the land and see. Find the runes and charms bearing my mark, and with them do as you please. I cannot wait to see what you will do with them," the outsider said. Naruto felt a sharp pain pierce his left hand before he could blink or speak again. He had the impression that someone had placed a branding iron against the back of his hand. The only thing Naruto could do in such agony was to curl into a fetal position and hold onto his burning hand. After a few seconds, the pain subsided, and Naruto looked down at his hand, where he noticed what appeared to be some kind of tattoo on his hand was some kind of complex symbol composed of a series of black markings. For a few seconds, a voice reverberated in his mind. The brand of the outsider. 1. There was a huge beast that woke up from its sleep deep inside Naruto's soul. The same mark on Naruto's hand was now visible on the large wall opposite its cage, and enormous glowing crimson eyes opened to see it. The red eyes squinted. It seems that the outsider has seen fit to grace the world with his mark once more. I wonder what my jailer will do with this new addition. Things have become even more interesting. A few years later, we discover Naruto laughing as he flees from a group of Chunin after deciding that the Hokage's tower needed a nice makeover. He painted a number of murals on the tower's exterior walls. Nobody knew how he managed to do it in the middle of the day. In actuality, there had been other incidents of this kind involving the blonde. Naruto had been able to perform feats that even the Hokage was in awe of for the past 2 years. The young boy could outrun and outlast even the most experienced Anbu, and even the Hokage, who had once chosen to join the hunt for the cunning Uzumaki, was unable to capture the blonde not because of Naruto's speed, but rather because the Hokage had actually cornered the blonde and was about to lecture the boy about his antics when he was interrupted. The Hokage had witnessed Naruto literally disappear from his position against the wall, only to reappear a few feet behind him. Hiruzen was shocked to discover that the boy had acted in such a deliberate manner. He had witnessed Naruto clenching his fist, which was surrounded by a pale blue glow. Naruto had vanished from view when he opened the fist, pointing in the direction he was heading. Hiruzen was even more shocked by what transpired after Naruto's ostensibly instantaneous teleportation. The young blonde was followed by a trail of light blue. Sarutobi. Hiruzen had sworn for the briefest of seconds that he saw a spectral representation of the Yondaime hovering over the beaming Naruto. The boy's use of the skill had been the only time anyone had witnessed it. Hiruzen was aware that Naruto was using it to help him pull practical jokes, but no one could see him doing it. Instead, he would appear to vanish from view for a split second. Naruto soon demonstrated a number of additional unexpected abilities. Every time he was cornered, a swarm of rats would appear out of nowhere and start biting and scratching the person who had cornered him. Naruto was able to escape the scene by using that diversion. The Sandaime had also used his crystal ball to see Naruto talking to the rats in the same way that the Inuzuka did with their dogs. Next was Naruto's extraordinary ability to sense everything and everyone around him, even in the dead of night, using his crystal ball to observe the Jinchuriki. Hiruzen had witnessed the ability firsthand one night at midnight. He witnessed Naruto prowling through the Hyuga compound. Hiruzen would have called the Anbu if it had been anyone else, but he saw that Naruto was carrying multiple paint cans and decided to ask the blonde what she was doing. But it was Naruto's avoidance of the guard patrols that drew his attention. They had no paths, so it didn't appear that he had learned them. In fact, he could see where they were, given that Naruto was looking through walls and under the cover of darkness. That was nearly impossible. Hiruzen would claim that Naruto was a very skilled sensor, or that he possessed the Byakugan if he didn't know any better. For Hiruzen, this was simply not adding up. Hiruzen was certain that Naruto couldn't do the things he was doing because they were either reserved for high-level jutsu or Kekkei Genkai. Naruto, who had been laughing, was now looking down at his Hokage. Because of this, the Chunin had not yet caught up, and Hiruzen was aware that he would not speak up if Naruto did. Hiruzen merely said, "Naruto-kun, I need to talk to you about something, and no, you're not in trouble, so please come to my office," before quietly leaving for his own office. With a shrug, Naruto leapt to the closest roof and bided his time. The Chunin who were pursuing him soon came to a halt on the roof beneath him and were ready to jump up and finally capture him. But before they could, Naruto clenched his fist, causing the mark on the back of his hand to glow a bright white and a familiar blue glow to surround it before he disappeared from view of the Chunin. He opened his fist and thrust the limb out. They were shocked to see him appear behind them, with multiple roofs separating them. With a sly smile, Naruto said, "Blink." Then he leapt back in the direction of the Hokage tower, too exhausted to even attempt pursuing the stamina demon. The Chunin all fell to the ground. In fact, Hiruzen was a little taken aback when Naruto sat down in the chair across from him and opened the door to his office calmly. Usually, the boy would show up in the office like he owned it or barge in like he owned it, which had nearly given the Sandaime a heart attack the first time. Naruto said, "So what did you want to talk about, Gigi?" Hiruzen started to say, "Well, how are you?" but Naruto cut him off. "Come on, Gigi, you and I both know that's not why you asked me to come here." Sarutobi merely let out a sigh before a steely gleam appeared in his eyes. "Naruto, you have been displaying several abilities that I have only seen be used by nin many years your senior or those gifted by a Kekkei Genkai. I am wondering how it is you are capable of such feats." For someone so young, Naruto's ability to look the man in the eye was impressive. The man known as the Kami no Shinobi would frequently look away from shinobi who were far more powerful. However, Naruto was different from them. Naruto then started talking, saying, "A man gave me a gift a few years ago." At this point, Naruto raised his hand and revealed to the elderly Hokage the emblem that had been carved into his skin as a young boy. Although Hiruzen was not a master of seals, he was nevertheless knowledgeable about the craft. Actually, only Orochimaru and Jiraiya of the Sannin, two of his own pupils, could defeat him. Even so, he was unable to comprehend the nature of the mark on Naruto's hand. It was obviously powerful, but Hiruzen had no idea what that power was or how it operated. The gift he gave me is what is allowing me to do all of those things. I don't quite understand how it or the techniques work. All I do know is what I can do with them, Naruto said. And who was this man who gave you that mark? I don't know his real name or where he came from. I only know that he has existed since before even the Rikudu and that the people who worshipped him called him the Outsider. This realization shocked Hiruzen. Sarutobi was aware that the renowned founder of the Shinobi Way had existed, even though many people today consider the Rikudu to be nothing more than a myth. However, that was hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it was hard to find anything from that era. It was astounding for Naruto to assert that the man who had granted him these abilities had existed even earlier. However, Hiruzen was moved by the fact that this man had followers. This man is only capable of being a god of some kind. And what were his stipulations upon giving these powers to you? And why did you in the first place? Hiruzen inquired. He didn't give me any stipulations at all. He said to use them as I see fit. As for why me? Well, he said that I interested him, Naruto mumbled. Has he come to you since he gave you those powers? Only once, a year after I was given them. He came to tell me what basic powers I had revived from him, and that if I wanted to make the powers stronger or gain new ones, that I should look for things called runes and bone charms. Leaning back in his chair, Hiruzen continued to stare at the mark on Naruto's hand. I see, and what, pray tell, exactly are those powers? Well, I showed you probably my most useful one, the one where I teleport. It's called Blink. I know that it has a certain range right now and is limited by what my eyes can see, meaning I can't pass through solid objects with it, Naruto said. It is a useful skill even though it is theoretically a very limited version of the Hiraishin. The outsider said that if I improved it by finding a rune, that the range would become farther and the amount of chakra I use would also lower, but even the basic version takes less than it does to perform a henge. He could thus somewhat replicate the Hiraishin using that rune. Hiruzen went on, and what other abilities do you have? Well, it's not really an ability so much as it is a gift, but I can communicate with rats and ask for their help again. Though with a few runes, the outsider said, I would be able to summon a swarm of special kind of rats known as plague rats. Hiruzen asked inquisitively, what is special about these plague rats? The skill had the terrible sound of a summoning contract. The outsider showed them to me, and well, they're bigger, much bigger, than normal rats. Other than that, they're carnivorous and can strip a man of his flesh and leave nothing, only bloodstains as evidence in less than a minute. Naruto was uncomfortable. He would always remember what the rats had done to a bandit in less than a minute. The creatures had eaten the corpse and the poor bastard alive. The idea of dying in such a terrible way troubled Hiruzen just as much. He had lived long enough to witness a few grisly deaths, but he had never wanted to witness that particular death. Anything else? Hiruzen nodded after swallowing. One last one, yeah, it's called Dark Eyes and lets me see through walls and even the sounds I make, and if others can hear them as well. This left Hiruzen speechless, with the exception of giving up the 360-degree view to be able to see sound waves, something any shinobi would kill for. It was nearly identical to the Byakugan. Again, I can upgrade that to dark vision, which expands my seeing range, allows me to see chakra, making it easier to spot shinobi in a crowd, and reduces the amount of chakra the ability uses. Even Sarutobi was starting to feel envious of Naruto. By this time, the most beneficial qualities of the Byakugan and Sharingan were essentially combined in this dark vision. It was the ideal weapon for a shinobi, and Naruto could practically transform into the Nidaime Kuroi Senku with the Kekai Genkai of both the Hyuga and Sharingan, thanks to the abilities that required as much chakra as a henge. However, there had to be a drawback to it all. Hiruzen inquired, is there any downside to any of these abilities? Well, dark eyes and dark vision don't really increase how far I can see, and because of the change of color I have to pay more attention to my surroundings due to some things blending in with each other. Also, it kind of hinders me in big open spaces. Naruto pouted as he admitted that his amazing eyes had some pretty serious flaws. Hiruzen gave a head nod. There were advantages and disadvantages to everything. And what of that blink ability? Naruto breathed deeply. Well, I can't really chain blink one right after the other. Doing so actually takes more energy out of me right now. I can only chain maybe 3 or 4 blinks before I start feeling tired. If I don't chain, there's about a 3-second wait for me to rebuild the lost chakra. If I do it that way, I can blink almost endlessly. He really can't use this blink ability to recreate the Hiraishin, huh? Minato didn't have to worry about getting tired while jumping hundreds of times in a second. He could still get fairly close with that upgrade, though. Then, lost in thought, Hiruzen stood up and swiveled his chair so that it faced the window. Although Naruto benefits greatly from these abilities, they also present some challenges. Naruto would be extremely ineffective in a team. Even though he would be ideal for espionage and assassination, that mark on his hand probably has something to do with his inability to blink around other people. Furthermore, despite his enormous reserves, he has mastered the use of smaller chakra bursts and self-hiding techniques. Even though his new skills are useless in large-scale frontline combat, he would still be an excellent ninjutsu expert. However, this renders the academy virtually useless to him. Placing him in a 3-person cell with a teacher would be a waste of his talents. He would excel in Anbu, but he is far too young and inexperienced to be assigned there right away. How to proceed? Hiruzen thought as he rubbed his beard. What fate would Naruto face? Even with these gifts, he was even more valuable to Konoha as a shinobi, but their regular shinobi corps was simply not for him. He was still a Jinchuriki, so he could not be disregarded. A sudden smile appeared on Hiruzen's face as he had an idea. Yes, that is ideal. In addition to making up for my inaction in Naruto's life, I'll be able to guarantee that he can protect Konoha and himself. Naruto, my boy, how would you like to receive some extra training? The Sandaime asked Naruto as he turned to face him. Naruto laughed. That'd be awesome, Gigi. But what would happen after my training? And what about the academy? Do not worry about that. You won't be attending the academy after today, and if you are successful at the end of your training, you will become the first ever royal guard. You will be my right hand, Naruto, and as such will receive only missions I give you while also protecting me from the shadows. You will become the Konoha no Kage, Shadow of the Hidden Leaf. Naruto laughed and said, I'll ace your training, Gigi. I guess you can say I'll be becoming a Kage in a different way though, huh? Yes, Naruto, you will, Hiruzen said with a smile. With a broad smile on his face, Naruto dozed off on his bed that night, eager to see what would happen the following day. But when he woke up, he was in a location he had come to know a little. The outsider, referred to simply as the Void, called it home. In the distance, there appeared to be whales amidst an endless swirling mass of purple. Here and there, pieces of land floated in strange positions, as if there were no gravity at all. Additionally, remnants of what appeared to be a highly developed civilization, actually, a number of distinct civilizations, were found here. Even fragments of what appeared to be Konoha were floating in the abyss. The outsider responded to Naruto's question about the location by saying, it is the place where all things begin and where all things shall end. The blonde simply turned to face the outsider when it emerged from the dark, black aura that Naruto was all too familiar with. You surprise me yet again, Naruto. You knowingly show your whole hand to a man who still hides several cards from you, and why? To feel needed. Do you think that by doing what he asks of you that you will finally gain the acknowledgement you've sought your entire life? Knowing that the outsider did not anticipate an answer, Naruto said nothing. While Hiruzen Sarutobi appears as a kindly grandfather figure, he is a man entrenched in lies, secrets, and failures so dark that they may well consume him. His hands are drenched in the blood of both the guilty and innocent, and yet you chose to reveal to him the truth. How interesting of you, Naruto. After the outsider had finished speaking, he withdrew once more into the darkness that encircled him, leaving Naruto to drift into a dreamless slumber with the smile no longer present on his face. That morning, Naruto woke up an hour and a half before the sun even began to rise. The night before, the Hokage had informed Naruto that he would begin his training today and that he would need to be stronger than most Anbu in order to assume the role of royal guard. He would need to train for as long as he could in order to achieve that, and given Naruto's level of stamina, that amounted to a significant number of hours. Naruto got out of bed and started his morning routine, which included taking a shower and brushing his teeth after a quick workout consisting of a dozen push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups to get the blood flowing. After that, he sat down to eat a few cups of ramen, which was the only real treat he could afford with the allowance he received as a village ward. The street lights were still on when Naruto left his tiny apartment, and the sky had started to turn a dark purple color. It was a strange moment, as the moon was not visible but had already started to disappear. With the sun rising to replace it, Naruto sucked in the crisp morning air and relished the brief moment before jumping from his apartment complex's balcony to the nearby roof. While traveling through the rooftops of his hometown, he had a strange thought. Everything is different today. I will probably still be assigned to the shinobi ranks even if I am unsuccessful in obtaining the title of royal guard. I will no longer be a mere civilian. I will defend this village. I will do everything in my power to protect this village and its residents. Starting today, I promise not to let Tibeo down. Naruto then accelerated, excited to start his training, with a smile on his face and fresh energy. For the next year I will be personally overseeing your training. For obvious reasons I cannot be with you all day, and during the times I am not I will leave you with something to work on or study. At the end of every other week we will have a test of sorts to see how your training goes, Hiruzen told the blonde Uzumaki. Ah, come on Gigi, tests. Do we really need some tests to measure how awesome I am? Naruto grumbled. Hiruzen laughed at the inappropriate behavior. Don't worry about them too much Naruto-kun, they won't be tests like the ones you had back in the academy. Instead they will be a lot more practical and pertain to the things you will be trained in. By the way, Gigi, what exactly will I be training in? Will I be able to spit fire like the Uchiha used to? Naruto asked, getting excited at that statement. The blonde he saw as a grandson made the Sandame laugh once more. Unfortunately I don't think such a skill will be helpful in your future position, so for now jutsu are out. Instead what I will be teaching you is battle tactics, planning, the basic academy jutsu, physical conditioning, and chakra control. The idea of not being taught how to use such a devastating technique made Naruto pout once more. However, he understood the Hokage's point that such jutsu would not be essential to any of his duties as a member of the royal guard. In addition, only the fabled Sannin could claim that the Hokage himself would be instructing him for a year. As a result, he accepted the lesson plan from his new sensei. There is however one jutsu that I will be teaching you that will be an invaluable asset to not only your future position, but your training as well. Normally this technique would not be available to you unless you reached Anbu position and got permission from me to learn it, but seeing that you're a special case I will be personally teaching it to you, Hiruzen laughed. Naruto exclaimed, is it some awesome, super cool Hokage technique? Something like that? Yes, it is called the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto gave the Sandame a perplexed look. A different type of clone jutsu? What's so special about it? You'll see very soon, my boy. A half hour later, the Sandame was seen proudly staring at two Narutos who were giddy with laughter. The boy does have his father's appearance and brilliance, but his personality and mannerisms may be more like those of his mother. As he puffed on his pipe, Hiruzen thought, he learned a B-rank kinjutsu faster than any experienced veteran. Put my record to shame too. Naruto exclaimed, so what's so special about this Bunshin Gigi? The clone was simply called to him by the elderly Kage, who then whispered something that the real Naruto couldn't hear. After finishing, the Kage struck the doppelganger on the head, causing it to vanish into a cloud of white smoke. Naruto realized what had happened and froze as he opened his mouth to ask the old man a question. Naruto asked, his eyes wide, they transfer their memories back to the original? The Sandame just nodded his head and smiled without saying anything. Naruto exclaimed, that is so awesome, Tibeo. With excitement the blonde then absorbed what the Sandame had told his clone and realized. I'm gonna be learning ninjutsu next year too? Yes, along with taijutsu, assassination, espionage, and trap setting, though I think you may be better at that aspect than even our village's best, the elderly Kage concluded with a laugh after the Sandame nodded once more. Before any of that I think it's about time to get started on what I will be teaching you. First make 5 clones. With a look of unwavering resolve on his face, Naruto nodded. 5 puffs of smoke appeared, revealing several more blondes, as he made the now memorized hand sign for the Kage Bunshin. Now one of you will be reading this text called The Art of War, another of you will be reading this scroll on basic chakra control techniques, the third one of you will be playing a game of shogi with one of my own clones, the fourth will be reading this scroll on the basic academy 3 with the help of the last clone. You yourself Naruto will be coming with me to get your body into shape. You got it Gigi, I won't let you down, Tibeo. I don't doubt that my boy, not at all. And so it continued for a few months. A clone would read a variety of texts about famous nin's philosophies, historical battles, and fundamental fighting techniques. One clone would concentrate on controlling chakras, while another would debate a political issue or play a game of shogi against the Hokage's clone in order for Naruto to use them without the need for hand signs. The final 2 clones were learning the fundamentals of Academy 3. Even Naruto was exhausting himself when he wasn't exercising. He was practicing the skills that the outsider had given him without the runes or bone charms. He couldn't make them any more potent or less draining, but he could shorten the time he needed to use them. Blinking used to require some focus and planning on Naruto's part, but now he could do it with just a swing of his marked hand, making it seem as natural as walking in the blink of an eye. Dark eyes could be activated. The Sandame made an intriguing observation as a result of that. When he actually saw Naruto using the dark eyes, he became extremely concerned. It turned out that Naruto's normally sapphire blue eyes became pools of black when dark eyes was used, resembling the outsider's own eyes. Following that revelation, the Sandame instructed Naruto to ensure that no one could see his eyes being altered when he used them naturally. Naruto had inquired as to why, telling the elderly Kage that they could pretend it was a brand new Kekai Genkai while his eyes were unsettling. The Hyuga and Uchiha's eyes were also unsettling when they employed their own dujutsu. The Hokage then informed Naruto that questions would be asked about his eyes because of their nature and appearance, which should not have been asked in the first place at the conclusion of their training together, when the boy would be a little older and more capable of handling the answers. He had promised his blonde pupil that he would reveal the answers to those questions to Naruto. The old Kage did not break his promise. Hiruzen sat Naruto down in his office, activating the privacy seals that covered the Kage's office, after the Sandaime had personally tested the young Uzumaki to ensure he was skilled at dissecting enemy strategies, could easily water walk, could plan his own strategies, and could run multiple obstacle courses designed for Anbu members. He then revealed all of this information to Naruto, including his parents' identities, his status as a Jinchuriki, and even the law he had created in connection with that status. The blonde had sat there for several minutes without speaking or moving. The Sandaime was concerned that Naruto would react negatively and despise his own parents, which was understandable given what they had done to him. To the Sandaime's delight, however, Naruto simply gave him a resolute glance and declared, "I'll make them proud and I will do what they wanted me to, protect this village and its people. I don't like what they did, far from it, but I can also see why they did it." Naruto's honest response to the question of how he felt about his parents was, "I may never have the chance to know the warmth of a mother's love or anything, but I will make sure that no one in this village has to suffer what I suffered through." The Sandaime also inquired about the blonde's feelings regarding his Jinchuriki identity and the way the villagers had treated him. The elderly man was taken aback by the response once more. "I can see why they ignored me. I'm a living reminder of what they lost that day. I can't say that I forgive them for that either, though I was just as much a victim as they were, but no sense in crying over spilled milk. Just because they can't move on doesn't mean I won't." With a smile on their faces, the Sandaime acknowledged how mature Naruto had become. But Naruto's day was different today. The Hokage had instructed him to meet at Training Ground 7 to meet his new instructors for the upcoming months instead of beginning his regular training regimen. Naruto saw what must have been one of the most motley-looking groups of people when he got to Training Ground 7 he had ever witnessed. They didn't look bad in terms of their attire or anything else, but rather as though they didn't belong to the same group and weren't even from the same village. Apart from the Hokage, the first person who attracted his attention was a tall man with dazzling silver hair who appeared to disregard gravity. He wore his headband crooked, covering his right eye, and a mask covered the lower portion of his face. He dressed in Konoha's typical Junin attire. An equally tall man who was, to put it mildly, peculiar stood next to him. The man wore the Junin flak vest, orange leg warmers, and an incredibly tight green jumpsuit. Naruto was frightened by the man's bushy eyebrows and bowl haircut. Two women who appeared to be close friends based on their conversational style were standing next to the two men, but in every aspect, the two appeared to be complete opposites. The purplette woman on the left was dressed in a mesh shirt, a tan trench coat, and a short, similarly tan skirt. The woman's only clothing item was that although she wore shinobi sandals and leg guards, they were insignificant in comparison to her ostentatious attire. The woman seemed to exude sex appeal, which was further enhanced by the fact that she was genuinely attractive with ample curves in the right places. The friend of the purplette, however, was more sophisticated. She was gorgeous where her friend was sexy. Bandages of some kind encircled her body, concealing her curves while exposing her arms and legs for everyone to see. Her friend appeared to enjoy flaunting her curves, but she covered enough to draw attention while still leaving people wanting more. All of that was enhanced by her curly black hair and wine-red eyes. The Hokage gave Naruto a nod when he fully entered the training area and attracted everyone's attention. "Good morning, Naruto-kun." With a bow, Naruto said, "Good morning, Sandaime-sama." Naruto had been taught some manners and how to act around politicians and the like by the Hokage for his job. It was essentially required. It was ineffective for the Sandaime to have the blonde go around calling Naruto Gigi, because they also wanted to conceal his identity when he did assume the role of royal guard. At this point, the Hokage paused to offer the silver-haired man a hand. "Naruto-kun, meet your teachers for the next couple of months. Kakashi Hatake is one of our best nin in the village and is a ninjutsu specialist second only to myself. He is also one of our best assassins, having been in Anbu for many years." The silver-haired man nodded his head at Naruto, the blonde returning the gesture. Next to him his Maida Guy, our village's best taijutsu expert and master of several styles, his most famous being the Goken, strong fist. The now-named guy gave a thumbs-up and cheesy smile at Naruto in response. Naruto nodded his head and nervously laughed at the strange man. "On my right we have Anko Mitarashi, one of our village's best interrogators and a good trap expert, though I think you may end up teaching her in that regard." The Sandaime laughed. Everyone there laughed at Anko's expense, the woman only pouting at the jab to her skills. Nice to meet you Anko-san sensei, Naruto said. Yay whatever Gaki, Anko remarked casually. To get their attention again, the Sandame coughed. And finally we have Kurenai Yuhi, a genjutsu mistress as well as being a more than proficient kunoichi in espionage. Naruto smiled and nodded at the stoic woman, the beauty only returning the gesture. Each day you will send 3 clones to Kakashi to have them work with him on anything he sees fit. You yourself will be going with Guy to learn a taijutsu to fit your style. Anko and Kurenai have agreed to train you together, so you will be sending 6 clones to them. Learn from them. If during the course of the day a clone pops, you are to send 1 to fill its place. Hi Hokage-sama! Exclaimed Naruto. I am trusting Naruto-kun to all of you. Do not let me or him down. Be as brutal and thorough as need be. Remember, I want him to be able to protect not only himself but me as well. Hi Hokage-sama. The various Junin chanted, then I will leave you to it, the Cage said before nodding and grinning at his young charge. He vanished in a whirlwind of leaves. The Junin stared at Naruto while he did the same, and for a brief moment nobody spoke or moved. It was hard to tell if each side was gauging the other up or if no one just didn't have anything to say at the moment when Naruto said arrogantly, well bring it on then, let's see what you guys have got for me. With a foxy smile, everything came to an end. Kurenai simply nodded her head. Anko smiled her own slightly insane grin. Kakashi's eyes smiled, and Guy. Yosh. The flames of youth burn brightly in you Naruto-kun. Let us feed their flames by running 5 laps around the village. Naruto thought that the upcoming months would be interesting. It turned out that the blonde Jinchuriki was right. It was true that the last 5 months had been interesting, but Naruto had also become stronger than he had previously believed. He was more than lethal with his own limited jutsu arsenal. Even though he was far from being a walking ninjutsu library like the Sandame or Kakashi, he was so proficient in both Koimari and Henge that he no longer needed to form their hand seals or even consider doing so. They were as natural to him as dark eyes and blink. Additionally, he had picked up some of Kakashi's flashy and large-scale jutsu, such as Suiten, Daibakufu, water release, great waterfall, and Futon, Daitopa, wind release, great breakthrough. Naturally, wind was his chakra nature, but he also had a slight affinity for water naturally. Kakashi and Naruto were not overly shocked by this, as they were both aware of his parents' identities. The two had developed an intriguing bond over that. Kakashi had viewed Kushina as a mother figure and Minato as a sort of father figure. He had told Naruto stories about his parents when they were unwinding or taking a break from training because, by default, Naruto was like a little brother to him. Curious, Kakashi raised the question when Naruto failed to ask him why he wasn't present for the blonde. Being in Anbu, you probably had more important things to do than worry about some blonde brat, said Naruto with a shrug. Kakashi was saddened by Naruto's barely concealed jadedness and shocked by his maturity. Kakashi had taught Naruto the Chidori, one of his original jutsu, as a way to atone for his failure to support the Uzumaki when he was younger. It should come as no surprise that Naruto learned the jutsu in just 2 days. Unfortunately, tunnel vision was one of the technique's fatal flaws. His dark eyes enhanced what Naruto's own eyes could already do, but they did not help him eradicate this like the Sharingan could, because they did not give him a complete visual perception of his surroundings like the Uchiha clan Dujutsu did. The outsider, however, decided to pay him a visit after he had mastered the technique and revealed again that Naruto could upgrade his eyes to the dark vision ability if he could locate the required runes. This would solve his tunnel vision issue. However, since Naruto would not be employing the Raiden Jutsu on the open battlefield, where its weakness could be readily exploited, the jutsu was still beneficial to him. The fact that Naruto's battles would take place in much smaller settings actually lessened the severity of the jutsu's flaw. Although the Rasengan would have been a better jutsu to learn, Kakashi was unable to teach it to Naruto because he was unable to use the technique as intended, which was his main motivation for creating the Chidori. This didn't bother the blonde, who went to the Hokage to find out if his parents had left him anything. The Hokage had thought it appropriate to let him know about the house he now owned as well as the jutsu library it contained. Unfortunately, Naruto could not fully claim the house and the title of clan head of both the Namikaze and Uzumaki families because he was still a minor and not a village ninja. Naruto would have been under the civilian council's jurisdiction because he was a village ward, but because he was a Jinchuriki and descended from 2 powerful shinobi families, he was directly supervised by the Hokage and the shinobi council. He could therefore temporarily enact certain rites with consent. Access to the jutsu library within the house his parents had constructed was one such privilege. The scroll with the Rasengan and instructions on how to learn it was in that library. In just 1 day, Naruto had mastered the jutsu. Nor had Guy slackened in his instruction of Naruto. He had actually been one of the group's more difficult taskmasters. Naruto had endured his pacings and more because of him. However, the Goken Taijutsu was not for Naruto, as both the sensei and the student were aware. Rather, they had concentrated on increasing Naruto's agility, speed, and endurance if permitted. The blonde Jinchuriki could deliver some bone-shaking blows, but his speed and endurance were his real strengths. Guy had taken advantage of that and taught Naruto a form of taijutsu that was designed to either eliminate the target with a few quick and easy moves or wear down the opponent with high-speed dodging and guerrilla warfare tactics. Kurenai and Anko had both done their best, with Anko teaching the boy the fundamentals of questioning and even delving into some aspects of torture. However, that had been postponed until later because Naruto was not yet mentally capable of handling that aspect of shinobi life. Rather than that, Anko taught him how to deceive people and even how to recognize when someone was lying to him. Kurenai had attempted to teach him the fundamentals of genjutsu, but Naruto's enormous reserves prevented him from learning anything that wasn't extremely close to reality-altering genjutsu, and even then they could be easily broken. This is because of the nature of his chakra as well as the size of his reserves. Simply put, the combination of Uzumaki and Biju chakras was too subtle to execute genjutsu correctly. Rather, Naruto learned a number of techniques from the genjutsu mistress to overcome even some of her more powerful delusions. She then assisted Naruto in the area of espionage after completing that. Given the enormous amount of chakra the boy possessed, she and Kakashi were astounded that Naruto was already so adept at stealth that he could even hide from them. She did, however, teach him how to use that stealth and how to extract information from even the most hazy hints. Naruto had completely turned into a spy as a result of Anko's instruction on how to distinguish between the truth and lies. Naruto was thus tested at the age of 10. The ideal testing ground for Naruto was created by the Hokage and his sensei. He had to pass 2 simulations. In the first, the Hokage, a Kage Bunshin serving as a stand-in, was attacked in his office and then again in the village's open streets by swiftly and stealthily eliminating the criminals. Naruto was able to either assist the Hokage in preparing to face the threat or quickly transport him to a safe location. After that, he was put to the test in 2 distinct combat scenarios. He was instructed to destroy the target, which was another Kage Bunshin, without revealing his presence. To their astonishment, Naruto entered and exited in less than 5 minutes, avoiding multiple security seals and guard patrols without ever warning them. Similar to the first scenario, he was given a target to eliminate in the second one, but the stakes were higher. Theoretically, he would be apprehended and made to complete his mission before making his getaway. Once again, Naruto gave a fantastic performance, demonstrating that even though he would struggle to apply his understanding of open combat, he was still more than capable of protecting himself from a number of Bunshin of the Chunin class. This was obviously far from a realistic scenario because taking the life of a clone was nothing like taking the life of an actual person, and the threat of life or death could not be experienced outside of actual missions. But the Kage and Junin knew that Naruto would get past those challenges and eventually acquire the experience necessary to become the ideal assassin. As a result, we find Naruto Uzumaki kneeling in front of the Hokage while wearing clothing made especially for him, and his new roll brown leather straps crisscrossed Naruto's chest, securing an all-black coat with gray linings around the bottom, hood, and cuffs that reached his ankles. Beneath the straps was what looked like a dark gray vest. His ankle-high brown boots were tucked into form-fitting black Anbu pants. Overall, Naruto has a very intimidating appearance. I Hiruzen Sarutobi, Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, officially named Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, is both my guard and my right hand. From henceforth none shall know of you or your position. You will protect me in this village from the shadows. You will be the Konoha no Kage, Shadow of Konoha. Do you accept your new position entitled Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze? Gazing up at the Hokage, Naruto's steely blue eyes met the Hokage's. Then, in order to display the outsider's mark, which started to glow a brilliant white, he crossed his left hand across his chest, clenched into a fist and facing outward. I Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze hereby pledge myself to the title of Hokage, and those who hold it I will give my life. It means the safety of my Kage and my village. On my honor as a denizen of this village I swear this. Then stand my sword and shield and take this mask, and with it mark the beginning of your new life. In this instance, the Hokage gave Naruto a highly elaborate mask that appeared to be far more sophisticated than anything Anbu could obtain. Because it was composed of steel, the mask had a steel gray color with occasional blood-red streaks. Thin metal rods crisscrossed from the bottom of the open mouth to the top, shaping the mask's mouth into an intimidating-looking smile. If Naruto had to guess, the eyeholes appeared to be made of some kind of reinforced glass that had been treated with chakra. This implied that he could zoom in on objects like binoculars by sending chakra to the mask's 2 eyes. A pair of fox ears in the same steel gray hue sat atop the mask. The ears' interiors were painted a rich crimson. The mosque's interior was cushioned with a soft cotton fabric of some kind, enabling it to be worn for extended periods of time if necessary. 1. Without giving it any thought, Naruto grabbed the mask and put it on his face using a variety of seals. It molded to his face and wouldn't come off unless he used chakra. Then he faced his teachers as he turned around and stood. The 10-year-old formed an intimidating figure, and Kakashi whistled at it. Guy voted in favor. Kurenai had to fight the urge to shudder at the terrifying thing in front of her as Anko smiled at the intimidating figure. Naruto had vanished, his bright blonde hair hidden by the hood of his coat and his identity concealed by the mask. He was replaced by the assassin and personal guard of the Hokage. That was the birth of the Hokage's royal guard. The Sandame said, "I have a mission for you, Usoku," to the bowing figure in front of him. Several months had passed since Naruto had formally assumed the title of Usoku, and during that time, he had completed a few missions that the Hokage had personally given him. 2 members of Konoha's own civilian council had been assassinated during 2 of those missions. The 2 had been discovered operating a prostitution ring in the nearby town of Tanzaku and stealing money from the village. After receiving approval from Hai no Kuni's daimyo, the Hokage dispatched Naruto to look after them. Their bodies were discovered the following morning with their throats slashed, their safes looted, and their guards either dead or disabled. A number of pictures and documents that described exactly what they had been doing behind the Hokage's back were included with said bodies. The Hokage simply threw the mission scroll he had given Naruto on the table when the other members of the civilian council demanded that the murderer be apprehended and prosecuted. The shinobi council merely grinned as the civilians became alarmed after everyone had read it. The Hokage calling out Naruto while he was wearing all of his mission gear, mask included, was the cherry on top. Naturally, everyone was aware that the Hokage was constantly protected by a small group of Anbu, but they were all taken aback when the Anbu commander asked who the masked person was, remarking that he had never seen either the mask or the individual in his division. The Hokage informed everyone about his newest guard while grinning in front of everyone. He revealed that he had personally selected and trained the figure. He had also received assistance from a number of powerful and high-ranking Junin in training the masked person. He continued by telling everyone that this individual was not listed on the village census and was not a member of the shinobi ranks. In all practicality, this figure was non-existent. In addition, he would only accept missions that were specifically given to him by the cage and only obeyed the Hokage himself. The 2 council members' deaths were caused by this individual, who was the Hokage no Asuko, right hand of the fire shadow, fulfilling his orders. Many failed to notice that Danzo was grinning as he observed everything unfold. Hiruzen, it appears that we have more things in common than we initially realized. However, I must admit that I never would have expected you to take my Nei Anbu idea and turn it into your own. The members of the civilian council had been successfully intimidated by that move, which also restored some of the authority the cage had lost in recent years as a result of the civilians' schemes. The Hokage then sent Naruto on 3 more missions: the rescue of another politician's daughter, another assassination mission of a corrupt politician in the daimyo's court, and, finally, a trip with the Hokage to negotiate a treaty with their ally Suna. Now his cage was giving him another mission. A man by the name of Gato has successfully managed to put Nami no Kuni in his pocket and is slowly draining it and its population dry. The man is a twisted foul man who owns the famous Gato Corporation, which he uses to cover up his less than legal activities. If we can free Nami of his grip, they may be grateful enough to want to talk an alliance, the Hokage said as he inhaled from his cigarette. And what of his safes and other valuables? Take a third of it for us as mission pay. The rest along with business documents are to be given to the village as a gift of sorts. Anything shinobi related, however, is to of course come back to us. Now go. Hi Hokage-sama. With his cloak and mask in place, Naruto vanished in a flurry of clothing. And what can I do for you, Danzo? The Hokage asked out loud as he turned his chair to face his office window while continuing to smoke his pipe. A man who appeared to be as old as the Hokage and was heavily bandaged appeared out of the shadows. Danzo continued to smile as he said, "Nothing, I was just observing you and your new little pet in action. It has been a while since I've seen you so active in worldly affairs." "Yes, it has. I simply saw the flaws in my way of thinking and wished to correct some mistakes in my old age," Hiruzen said, unfazed by the veiled insults directed at his persona. Danzo gave that remark a rueful laugh. "You and I both know that there's nothing we can do to cleanse our hands of the blood that stains it. It is too late for us." Danzo started to leave the office, but he stopped with his hand on the door handle and said, "By the way, you've done a fine job of training the Jinchuriki. I do wonder where you got those odd powers from though." Hiruzen started to unclench his hands as the elderly Warhawk left the room. His hands had been gripping his chair so tightly that the wood beneath the leather and padding had started to splinter and crack. "I can still try, Danzo, I can still damn well try," the old cage muttered to himself. Naruto immediately noticed the change in weather as he entered the Land of Waves after crossing the boundary between the Land of Fire and the latter. The opposite was true for Nami, which was likely caused by the country's closeness to both the ocean and Mizu no Kuni, whereas Hai no Kuni was typically always warm and sunny. But before Naruto could proceed with his journey into the Misty Country, he experienced a pulling that hadn't occurred to him in several months. Not since his initial killings in Konoha. Many people would typically wonder what this tugging was or what it was trying to tell them, but Naruto was fully aware of what the feeling was trying to tell him. As a result, the blonde stopped, jumped to the ground, and waited calmly. Indeed, a familiar black-eyed creature emerged from the pitch-black darkness shortly after. A familiar shroud of black mist appeared out of nowhere. Interesting how even with so many things changed you still end up here. Even more interesting is both this place's once great history and the secrets that now lay buried thousands of feet below it. What will you find here, I wonder? The outsider said, I'm going back to the void with peace. Why do all the knowledgeable people prefer to speak in ambiguous riddles? Both the outsider and the Sandaime do it. Are they really that fond of playing with people? Huffing at the outsider's hints, Naruto pondered. He went on, I think they just like to mess with me. More specifically. Naruto shrugged and left again, leaving only a blurred shadow for anyone who happened to see him. He continued to wonder, though, exactly what the outsider had said. What made Nami no Kuni so unique? It had been a fairly prosperous port town and trading outpost in the past, but that was about all that existed. The only other noteworthy aspect of it was its closeness to Uzugakure, his mother's ancestral home, as well as Kirigakure and Konohagakure. Perhaps that was what the outsider had been discussing after all. He doubted that many had tried to excavate the ruins for whatever goods were still hidden, given how difficult it was to even approach Uzu because of the whirlpools that gave the village its name. Furthermore, he doubted that a clan of Fuinjutsu masters would simply leave their belongings for the taking, meaning that only an Uzumaki could access the village's more intriguing possessions. Naruto decided to visit Uzugakure and see if there was anything there that he could use or preserve as a memento of his mother's clan. After giving that idea some serious thought, Naruto had to suppress the urge to go grab Gato and drag him screaming and kicking into the village so he could kill the bastard and aid these people while he was out on the streets disguised as a henge that made him appear to be any of the villagers. He was disgusted by the sight of so many people wearing nothing but rags, children whose bodies were malnourished from prolonged fasting, and people clutching the bodies of departed loved ones. Naruto would have been upset with the villagers for not taking matters into their own hands and killing Gato themselves if they had looked a little better, but none of them appeared to have enough energy to breathe, much less launch an uprising against the business magnate. Furthermore, who was he to criticize these individuals and their choices? Luckily, the outsider had given him his mark and the means to reclaim his life and turn it into something worthwhile. The Sandaime took him under his wing, trained him personally, and welcomed him into the Sarutobi clan home, which only served to further aid that mission. These folks had absolutely nothing. He would claim that they had family, but even so, that was only possible if the groups of homeless and parentless kids were any indication. The sight of so much suffering stoked a fire inside Naruto that was driven by a desire to use all available means to aid the people as well as a hatred for Gato. Naruto saw a chance to complete his mission and restore hope to these impoverished people when he witnessed a group of Gato's hired muscles start to harass a woman and her 2 children, one of whom was still a toddler. With a senbon stuck in one thug's neck and a kunai buried in the skull of another, Naruto both dropped the henge and emerged behind the gang of thugs in a flash of movement. Not just the other mercenaries but also the other civilians on that same street were alerted by the sound of 2 bodies striking the ground before anyone could blink. Naruto was on the other merc, using a kunai to slit the poor bastard's throat open. The blood spurts that followed stained a nearby wall red. The final member of the thugs group discovered a hand wrapped around his throat with a senbon pointed at his eyeball before he could do more than open his mouth in shock. When the man looked down, he saw something that would always haunt his nightmares. A metal mask that was otherwise silver but had flecks of bloody carmine on it. What chilled him was the smile on the mask's face, which was made all the more terrifying by its foxy features. The man was appalled and sputtered, "WW, what the fuck are you? Where is Gato?" Naruto asked without even acknowledging the question, his voice muffled by the mask, which also gave it a chilling quality. The man managed to say, "I ain't," before a senbon needling pierced one cheek and then slid through the other. Ignoring the man's cries of agony and the eyes on him, Naruto brutally extracted the needle and said, "Gato, where is he? He's got a compound on the outskirts of the south end of this town. Keep going straight out of the south entrance. You can't miss it now. Please just let me go. I swear I'll leave town," the man begged. For a moment, Naruto turned to look at the villagers' expressions. Instead of seeing fear of him or the thug, or even sympathy for the man, He saw righteous anger and thankfulness that someone had stood up for them. He then noticed awe on the face of the older child as he turned to face the mother and kids that the thug and his small group had been harassing. The single mother's brown eyes were filled with gratitude and hope as she stared at Naruto, who was otherwise a terrifying figure. After considering all of this, Naruto decided to focus his attention once more on the man he was still holding. After muttering the barely audible word, "No," Naruto killed the man almost immediately by driving the kunai right through his skull. After a little kaiden jutsu, the men's bodies were reduced to ashes that the wind could disperse. As Naruto started to move away, the single mother approached him, holding him in her arms, and tugged at his sleeve to get his attention. When Naruto turned to accept the gesture, he was a little taken aback when the woman bowed her head and said, "Arigato stranger, you saved both me and my children, and for that I thank you. I have nothing to give you but my gratitude." Naruto grinned slightly beneath the mask and said, "Think nothing of it now, I have some business with Gato." Naruto left without saying another word and sped off in the direction of Gato's base. Naruto started to experience another tugging sensation as he dashed through the treetops on his way to Gato's compound, but it wasn't nearly as intense as the one the outsider used to call his attention. Rather, it seemed to be a calling. In fact, he could hear soft murmurs emanating from the forest, which drew him in like a lovely, eerie, but inaudible song. Naruto chose to take a brief detour in the direction of where he heard the song coming from because whatever was calling him felt so much like the outsider. This decision conveniently only caused him to stray a little from his intended course. Already accustomed to the mumbled whisper of paradise, one, that accompanied it, Naruto slowed down his previous pace and, without thinking, summoned his dark eyes ability. He then started searching the forest, keeping an eye out for whatever was calling. To his surprise, however, as the whispering became even louder, something strange caught his attention. Naruto looked curiously at a rather small house that appeared to have seen better days, located in the middle of a clearing in the forest. Normally, Naruto would have stopped there for the day, but now that he was so close to this rundown structure, the whispering had become even louder and the tugging had become even more intense. However, he was taken aback when he saw an elderly-looking woman emerge through the building's rotten door. Naruto couldn't help but wonder how old the elderly woman was. Naruto thought she was so weak that she would turn to dust if he even touched her. Her hair, which she wore in a ponytail that reached the base of her neck, had turned completely white due to the extreme graying. She was wearing what appeared to be a pretty gown at one point. Now it had holes in it that revealed a hint of her wrinkled skin, and it was covered in stains. Her eyes were dark brown and seemed to be screaming age and wisdom, and her face was sunken in. He was taken aback when the woman turned to face him and grinned, saying, "And who might you be, dearie? I usually don't get too many visitors these days." Acknowledging the futility of hiding, Naruto leapt from the tree and landed a few feet away from the woman, who continued to smile at him. The blonde killer bowed and said, "I'm sorry if I bothered you, ma'am." The lady just grinned, "Oh, no trouble at all, dearie. Now why don't you come inside and I can make us some tea, we have much to discuss." With a quick glance toward Gato's compound, Naruto said, "I'm sorry, but I really must be going." "Well, that just won't do. Won't you please indulge an old woman with a cup of tea? It has been so long since I've had any sort of company." The old woman was trying to guilt him into staying, and damn if it wasn't working, Naruto realized, and he started to perspire. "Damn my generosity," the blonde admitted. "Well, okay, just for a little while because I do have a job to attend to." After grinning once more, the elderly woman ushered Naruto through the door and into an unexpectedly clean den. In contrast to the exterior, it appeared generally well maintained. Although it had undoubtedly seen better days, there were pictures and other trinkets strewn throughout the house, which contributed to the overall cozy and inviting atmosphere. Numerous books with odd titles such as Harpooner Songs, The Isle of Tivia, and Mysteries of Pandasia were arranged on a wall-mounted bookshelf, too. The room's walls were covered in a variety of paintings, but one in particular drew his eye. A man with shaggy brown hair parted to either side was one of the three individuals in it. He wore a coat similar to Naruto's, with the exception that it was gray in color and covered the black and gold vest he wore underneath. Without a doubt, the woman beside him was stunning. She wore black clothing appropriate for royalty and had her hair pulled into a complicated bun of sorts. She was holding a little girl who looked eerily like the two adults in the photo and had a broad smile on her face. When the elderly woman noticed Naruto examining the painting with considerable interest, she laughed and said, "Interesting how that particular painting caught your eye, young man." She approached Naruto and started to appreciate the artwork as well. "They were my family's ancestors." The child's name was Emily Caldwin, her mother's was Elizabeth Caldwin, and the man was Corvo Itano. Emily and Elizabeth's personal guard as well as father and secret lover. They had to keep it secret, with Elizabeth being the queen at the time. Sad how it all ended for them though. Naruto asked inquisitively, Wait, queen. Where was she queen of? Only the royalty of Roran sprang to mind, and he was aware that there were not many queens left in the world. She was queen to a place long since lost to the world, sunk beneath the waves and buried under time like the civilization before it. She, and later her daughter Emily, ruled over the metropolis of Dunwall. Dunwall. That name sounds familiar, but why? Why do I think I recognize that name if everyone has truly forgotten it? Come now, dearie, the tea is done and we do still have to talk. Still preoccupied with his thoughts, Naruto nodded. Unbeknownst to him, a certain kitsune mused to itself as well. Interesting, so the Kaldwin, Atano line still lives to this day, though with this woman being the last of them the line will die with her no doubt. The great beast went back to sleep without another thought. May I see it? The elderly woman asked, grinning as the two sat at the table. Confused, Naruto said, I'm sorry. All the woman said was, the mark that the outsider gave to you. In stunned silence, Naruto sat. How was this woman familiar with the outsider? The creature had claimed that before the Rikudo had ever existed, everyone who knew his name had long since perished. How could this frail elderly woman have known about such a long-forgotten entity? It was even more startling that she knew he had the mark. You're wondering how I know of such a thing, correct? Well, you see, the man in the painting, Corvo, was also visited by the outsider and given his mark during a very tumultuous time in Dunwall. With that mark, the powers it gifted him, and his own skill as an assassin and warrior, Corvo single-handedly put down 2 rebellions, placed his daughter back on the throne and brought peace to the chaotic times of Dunwall, all in only a month. The woman continued. On his deathbed, Corvo revealed to the now-grown Emily all that he had done to keep her safe and how he was able to do things no human should be capable of. How he could seemingly vanish from one spot and appear in another, how he could move faster than anybody for a short period of time, why the rats that bore the plague were his allies. He told her of his many talks with the being known as the outsider and what the man had given him. Naruto asked, but, how do you know I bear the mark? The woman only gave a knowing grin. Because my family has passed on the knowledge of such things. The power of the mark is not something so easily dismissed. Also, the few runes that we have kept for ages stirred when you neared this place, something they haven't done since the time of Corvo. Before removing his mask and shaking out his hair despite his matted blonde locks, Naruto paused to reflect for a moment. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. And I am Rosalind Kaldwin. Nice to meet you, Naruto Uzumaki, the woman said, extending her hand. In order to avoid testing how weak she truly was, Naruto gave the offered hand a gentle shake while also revealing the black mark he had grown so used to seeing. The elderly woman traced the raised lines of the mark with her fingertip and grinned at the sight of something she had only seen in old photographs and heard about from her own mother, who had upheld the Kaldwin line's tradition as strongly as previous generations had. May I? Rosalind asked, pointing to the mask on the table. As he ascended, Naruto nodded, and Rosalind took the mask in her hands and looked at it. The final Kaldwin member appeared to be absorbed in her own world for a few minutes, gently touching the mask and merely examining it before saying, funny that not only are you an assassin, but that you have this mask. Naruto questioned, what do you mean by that? Rosalind gave him the same sly smile before setting his mask down on the table, getting up, and leaving the room. She returned a few minutes later with a metallic box that had a lock on the front of it. After setting the box on the table, she took a key out of the last pocket of her gown and inserted it into the lock. The lock unlocked with a single click, and Rosalind carefully removed its contents. She was holding a rather battered metal mask that bore a striking resemblance to Naruto's own, but instead of the fox skull that was Naruto's, this mask resembled a human skull. There were no bloody streaks on it either. Strangely, the mask's right eye had what appeared to be a telescopic lens, another resemblance. This was the mask Corvo donned when he first set out to save Emily and bring peace back to Dunwall. It soon became a symbol of fear to those who had dared wrong not only him, but his family at the same time. It was also a symbol of hope for young Emily and those who wished to see her back on the throne and peace restored. The mask was crafted by an ingenious inventor by the name of Piero Joplin, who also crafted several other useful tools for Corvo. Here, Rosalind carefully set the mask down on the table before reaching into the box again to retrieve another object. This time, there was no obvious blade, but it appeared to be a sword handle of some kind due to age and usage. The handle itself was rusty and worn. Naruto was taken aback by the elderly woman's startling level of dexterity and hand-eye coordination as she spun the object in her hand before a gleaming blade protruded from the handle's center. The blade itself appeared to be brand new and composed of some incredibly durable materials, even though the handle appeared worn. Even Naruto, who knew very little about swords, could tell that this blade was expertly crafted. This was the weapon Piero made specifically for Corvo. The blade folds and can remain hidden in the handle until the time it is needed to do its job. Sadly, these are the only two weapons that remain. Corvo's crossbow and gun were lost only a few decades after Emily's death, Rosalind said with a sigh. Glancing at Rosalind, Naruto silently requested her consent to handle the artifacts, and she granted it. The blonde was taken aback by Corvo's mask's resemblance to his and its excellent construction. Naturally, he didn't require the telescopic eye that Corvo's had or the hooks and other components that would have locked the device to the wearer's face because of the seals and chakra conductive metals in his mask. Taking the sword in his hands, Naruto carefully examined it, observing the location of the switch that released the blade and noting the level of skill required to simultaneously hit the switch and release the blade, making it ready for battle. As Rosalind had done, it was long and sturdy enough to be suitable for some open combat use, but it was also small and light enough to be ideal for covert killings. The blade was incredibly well balanced, and holding it in his hands felt natural. Naruto was startled out of his reverie when Rosalind yelled, "Take them." "Why?" was the most pressing question in Naruto's wide-eyed eyes as he looked up at the smiling woman. "I can feel it. Just like Corvo, you too will play an instrumental role in the future, and it seems only fitting that the blade that changed Dunwall's fate will do so again in the hands of yet another assassin and bearer of the outsider's mark. Take it and the mask and use them to strike fear into the hearts of evil and bring hope to those who have need of it. I may be the last of the called ones, but you, Naruto Uzumaki, will be an assassin with no equal. You will carry on the will and name of the greatest assassin and warrior to ever live. Corvo Atano, do you accept?" After a brief moment of hesitation, Naruto felt as though the mask and blade were calling to him, pleading with him to use them again so they could see battle and assist their user as they had done for thousands of years. Naruto stood before Rosalind, bowed on one knee, and said firmly, "I, Naruto Uzumaki, accept this request and will do my utmost to stay true to the will of the called ones and Atanos." His eyes were full of renewed passion. Unbeknownst to either of them, Kyuubi had once again woken up and was silently watching the events outside with a grin that made the already terrifying situation seem even more real. "You really are so very interesting, Naruto Uzumaki. As the last of the Calvdine line, I proclaim you as Naruto Atano Uzumaki." Naruto took Corvo's mask and put it on his face while maintaining a straight face, but something unexpected happened. Rosalind grinned at the sight of the mask being instantly covered in a thin layer of flaming orange chakra and disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. A rusted, dented, and broken ancient relic was replaced by a new symbol. The linings, which had once been golden, had turned a dull ruby red to contrast with the dark black of the metal. The mask's mouth had moved and assumed the smiling face of insanity, which was further accentuated by the vulpine features that were now visible although it lacked fox ears. The eyes were slanted to give the mask the appearance of a kitsune with a wild smile, unlike Naruto's mask. Naruto could only smile and shake his head when Rosalind showed him the now revitalized mask in a mirror. "I suppose the Kyuubi also wanted to participate in some of the action." She then showed him Corvo's folding blade, which was engulfed in a fiery stream of vivid orange chakra, just like the mask after it was gone. The two looked admiringly at the handles and its blade's polished metallic sheen. Naruto was shocked to see flames covering the sword after instinctively channeling chakra through the blade. "I suppose I owe that fuzzball something for such lovely presents," Naruto laughed. The elderly woman handed Naruto two strange-looking, thin bone plates with the outsider's mark carved on them and the words, "Now take these as well, you'll need them." She also gave him what appeared to be a fan's blade, which was made of the same kind of bone and had a number of strange markings. "The two plates are runes that you can use to upgrade your powers, and that little one is a bone charm called Acrobat. I don't know how they work exactly, as neither did Corvo or their creators, but Acrobat will increase your overall dexterity beyond even what most shinobi are capable of. As for the runes, again, I don't know. That knowledge was lost as only someone with the mark of the outsider could use the runes." Before a feeling of lightness took over, Naruto felt something similar to the power of chakra, but much darker, rush through his body as soon as he touched the bone charm. "I feel like I've shed a few dozen pounds. This is really awesome." After attaching the tiny charm to one of the numerous leather straps holding his cloak shut, Naruto picked up the runes. The runes appeared to be holding back their power until Naruto made a decision about where to direct it, in contrast to the instant rush he experienced when using the charm. Naruto summoned his dark eyes power based on a gut feeling. He was a little taken aback when the runes responded and a surge of the same dark power appeared in his eyes. Several items, particularly the runes and bone charms, were immediately highlighted, and the previously dimly lit orange and yellow world that the dark eyes used became a little brighter. Rosalind also started to glow a faint yellow, and her ruffled gown created tiny waves as if light were emanating from her eyes. Surprisingly, Naruto was able to see through the house's walls as well, catching a glimpse of the tiny creatures darting through the surrounding forest. He uttered the simple words, "Dark vision." Rosalind just grinned again. "Now go and clean this place up. Gato deserves everything you will bring him." Rosalind walked slowly behind Naruto as he nodded and left the house. When they arrived at the doorway, Rosalind caught Naruto's attention by grabbing his shoulder before he could jump off into the treetops to continue his mission. "Remember, order shall prevail, but revenge solves everything." Naruto nodded, his new dark vision activated, his mask securely in place, his folding blade concealed in his coat, his bone charm on full display, and he leapt into the trees, leaving nothing but a blur of black and gray. As she watched him leave, Rosalind grinned slightly and turned to return to her house. "Naruto Uzumaki, Corvo would be proud, right, Mr. Outsider?" "Yes, he would. Now I'm afraid our deal is up. Emily called one time to join me and your father in the void." "Thank you for letting me do that, Outsider. Despite what you may think, I did not do it for you or Corvo. I did it solely to see how young Naruto would react, and I am pleased to say his reaction to your gifts was superb. With those items in hand, things have become even more intriguing. I cannot wait to see how you uses that blade and the new powers available to him." The Outsider smiled and extended a hand, saying, "Milady." With a single smile, the now exposed Emily said, "Let us be going then." Emily was enveloped in a shroud of pitch blackness as she took the Outsider's hand, and as the shroud vanished, they returned to the starting point of everything and the point at which everything went to meet its unavoidable end. With a broad smile on his face, Naruto declared, "I am adored this dark vision." The forest was enveloped in a dark shroud of night, with the moon's luminous light serving as the sole natural illumination source. Nonetheless, Gato was extremely paranoid, so he made sure his compound was well lit with a variety of light posts so his guards could see even in the dark. Most shinobi might have had some problems with this, but Naruto did not. Without ever leaving the shelter of the trees that encircled the clearing surrounding Gato's compound, he was able to use his newly acquired dark vision to scout out the locations of the different guards that patrolled the grounds. Naruto now effectively had the Byakugan in his arsenal thanks to the telescopic features of his new mask, even though it lacked the 360-degree field of vision. Naruto produced one of his newest tools and flipped a switch, releasing the blade with a note that was almost melodic. Naruto whispered softly, "Let's see what you can do," while holding the sword in reverse. Naruto was able to sneak up behind an oblivious guard with just one outstretched hand and a blink. Normally, Naruto would want to avoid as many guards as possible and either leave them alone or simply knock them out, but these weren't just any hired guards. No. Gato had employed a number of bandits and low-class mercs. Because he was a cheap bastard, a typical guard team would just brush it off and move on to the next job if they lost their boss or paycheck because they didn't want to incur any needless losses. However, this group was more likely to use Gato's location as a base of operations and raid nearby towns. Naruto would need to eliminate all of the guards, or at least enough of them to ensure that they were unable to raid anyone for a considerable amount of time if he wanted to give Nami a head start on starting over. In light of this, Naruto prepared himself for the somber task he would have to complete tonight. Before a blade slid across his throat, spraying the carmine-colored liquid of life and permanently silencing him, the random thug felt only the slightest touch of a hand on his shoulder. "Enhanced eyes," the whisper said as Naruto summoned dark vision once more. After glancing around to make sure no guard had moved or was approaching him, Naruto decided it was safe to move swiftly and stealthily into the shadows cast by the compound's walls. Beneath the veil of darkness, where not even the compound's lights could reach him, he patiently awaited the approaching guard and his friend. The loud voice of one of the modest guards asked, "So whiskey and cards tonight? One?" When his fellow criminal attempted to respond, he discovered that something was obstructing his throat, preventing the words from being spoken out loud. He examined the end of the blade that was now protruding from his windpipe with morbid fascination. Curiously, he saw a single drop of blood trickle from his throat down the angled blade and onto the floor, where it joined the other drops of blood that now painted the dirt beneath his feet and stained the ground. Time appeared to return to its normal course as the realization of what he was witnessing struck when the now painted blade was removed from a thug's airway. It easily pierced a lung after passing through his comrade's chest cavity. All of this happened so quickly that neither of them had time to fully comprehend their fate before they both fell to the ground simultaneously. Naruto just flicked the blood from his blade and carried on with his bloody journey to Gato, his face emotionless. "Alright boys, I'm calling it a night." Taking their cue, the businessman's personal guards followed him to his bedroom, where they would spend the remainder of the night watching his door. However, the three-person entourage noticed how strangely quiet it was at this hour of the night. Normally, the sounds of the different guards gambling or drinking their fill would fill the place, but there were no such noises, and in fact, it sounded almost like a pin dropping, as though no one was still there. Although they were rogue nin, they were still shinobi at heart, and as a result, both of Gato's personal guards tensed and drew kunai, displaying the paranoia that all shinobi were taught. The unspoken cue for the unassuming man to leave his position at the tycoon's side and look for whatever it was that had managed to silence his small army was Gato's simple nod to one of the nin. Gato resumed his journey to his master bedroom, determined to get to his bed, confident in the abilities of the two Kiri missing nin he had hired. He had no idea that this would be his final journey through these corridors. The short man went into his bedroom and locked the door, but if he had bothered to look behind him as the door closed completely, he would have run as fast as he could have, seeing Naruto's blade bring his last bodyguard to a bloody but silent end. However, Gato was startled when he looked at his door and saw Naruto, the terrifying character, standing there motionless and nearly immobile. Fear pulsing through his veins, Gato shakily asked, who are you? Without uttering a word, Naruto simply revealed his now bloody sword. Gato understood what had happened, why it was so quiet, and why he would probably not live to see the next day when he saw the drop of crimson liquid drip onto his wooden floor. Even his misfortune was not as important to Gato as his own life. Don't kill me, I'll give you anything you want, just tell me what you want and I'll make it happen. Gato groveled at his executioner's feet while on his knees. Having already determined that this man, if he could be called that, would no longer be able to harm the people of Nami or anybody else for that matter, Naruto remained silent once more. Naruto had read the man's file, which contained a long list of crimes for which he was only suspected, including drug trafficking, murder, illegal business practices, blackmail, and running multiple prostitution rings. However, those were just the crimes for which he was suspected. Gato's hands were so dirty that it was impossible to tell. Naruto slowly started to move closer to the trembling mass of flesh, his resolve strengthened by thoughts of how cruel and evil the groveling man in front of him was. His silent assassin had crossed the room and stood in front of his kneeling form before Gato even realized it. The only sound he made was the occasional drop of blood hitting the spotlessly clean wooden floor. Naruto knew that even after Gato had left, there were still people waiting in the shadows to take the man's place. Even though every bone in his body was screaming for him to kill the man in front of him and exact righteous vengeance for the lives he had destroyed. In other words, he had to allow the man to live, at least a little longer, in order to ensure that Gato corporations and its schemes were permanently halted. The short man's attention was drawn to a blank scroll that clattered to the floor in front of the cunning businessman. Naruto said, I want you to write down the names of all your investors and business partners and then sign your name with it, in a spooky voice that was changed by his use of chakra and the mask that concealed his identity. Oh, of course. Right away. Gato hurriedly wrote down every name he could think of, including those who had funded him, those he dealt with, and some of his more regular clients, believing that if he did so, the nearly demonic figure in front of him would spare his life. Gato was smiling maniacally inside, believing that he would only benefit if the man spared him and his fortune while also eliminating his more avaricious investors and the like. Gato confidently returned the scroll, which contained information that was almost unbelievable in its neatness and precision, after the task was completed. Since Gato would not have been able to achieve his current wealth and prestige by being foolish, Naruto only reluctantly nodded in agreement with the almost shinobi-like formality of the writing. In a newly self-assured voice, Gato stood up and said, That's everything from my investors and business partners to even my more frequently seen customers. I thank you for letting me live, kind sir. When Gato managed to take in the detail of the terrifying mask, Naruto's gaze shifted from the scroll back to the shorter man, sending a chill down his spine given how terrifying the mask appeared and the almost unearthly glow in the wearer's eyes. Gato could have easily mistaken the man for a demon of some kind if he hadn't known any better. I never said I'd let you live, Naruto uttered. Gato didn't even have time to process the impact of his assassin's statement before Naruto's blade began slicing through the air with a sound that sounded almost like singing. The assassin's weapon cut through Gato's neck's muscles, veins, and bone with the same ease that it had cut through the air, thanks to Naruto's forceful swing and the blade's inherent sharpness. The dull thump of Gato's head hitting the floor was the only sound that came next. His headless body followed a few seconds later, falling to the ground like a marionette with its strings severed. At both sounds, Naruto simply turned his head away and flicked his blade to wipe the blood off the immaculate metal. Not even flinching, the blonde assassin pivoted on his heel and started to stealthily approach the distant wall, which was nearly completely obscured by a huge painting of the now deceased businessman. With only a slight shake of his head, Naruto revealed that Gato had concealed a huge safe behind the painting by using a small Kaiden jutsu to burn it. Do these guys attend any kind of school? To be honest, I kind of thought Gato would be much less cliched, but whatever, it makes my job easier, Naruto said with a mental shrug. When Naruto's normally sapphire blue eyes transformed into bottomless abysses of inky shadows, the familiar murmur, enhanced eyes, emerged. The most recent upgrade allowed him to see through walls to a certain extent, which was all he needed to successfully figure out the safe's combination. After a few twists and clicks, Naruto was carrying some of the jewels and any other shinobi-related objects in one of the sealing scrolls he was carrying. The remaining contents of the vault, including financial records, land documents, and business documents, were placed in a different scroll that Naruto would be delivering to the Nami villagers. Normally, it would go to the daimyo, but since Gato likely planned the death of Nami's daimyo, the people would need to choose a new leader to handle the paperwork and other political matters. With his work nearly finished, Naruto started to leave the compound without even giving his handiwork a sidelong glance. Was he pleased that he could make so many people's lives better? Naturally, was he pleased that so many other lives had been lost in the process? Not at all. While it was true that some of the mercenaries who had perished on this particular night would not think twice about stealing, rape, or taking a life, there were still more who had turned into mercenaries because it was their only option for providing for their families. There was very little distinction between merc and shinobi, and it was easily muddled. The residents of Wave were still human despite their problems and awful circumstances. This implied that they themselves were not totally sinless. Gato's life was the only one that Naruto genuinely did not regret taking because his soul was as twisted and corrupt as it could be. For him, there was no salvation. Naruto let out a deep breath and started walking back in the direction of Nami, leaving his victims' bodies for the forest's creatures. The clearing that the deranged businessman had created for himself would eventually be reclaimed by nature, which would eventually follow its natural course and remove the bloody stains that had marked the land here. Tazuna was a man with a lot of issues and few solutions to deal with them. He was the only construction worker in his village with the know-how and ability to construct a suitable bridge, and as such, he was the only thing that could save his fellow villagers from the vice grip that Gato had them in. However, doing so would put him on Gato's hit list, endangering not only his own life but also the lives of his family. Tsunami, his only daughter, reluctantly and tearfully accepted his decision to begin bridge construction. It was his duty to improve the lives of his family and the entire village if there was even the remotest possibility of doing so, and he had the ability to do so. But after just 1 month of work, Gato had brutally expressed his disapproval of the bridge's construction. Many of the few courageous men who had decided to assist Tazuna in building the bridge were removed from their homes and never returned. Even so, Tazuna persisted because she and the other workers who were assisting in the bridge's construction did not want the deaths of such courageous men to be in vain. Tazuna, however, had made the decision to risk his life in an attempt to flee his village and seek assistance from the nearest hidden village, Konoha, because he knew deep down that Gato would only become more determined in his attempts to deprive them of the hope the bridge represented. He was aware that the bridge's construction and the prospect of a better future free from Gato's schemes were very much within his grasp. If he was successful in recruiting the assistance of a few shinobi, at least he would have tried his hardest if he didn't succeed. As Tazuna descended the stairs, he noticed his daughter in the kitchen, completing the meal she was preparing for his lengthy journey. When she looked at him, her eyes already wet from the tears she was trying to contain, he smiled and placed a calloused hand from years of working with his hands. "Soon, Tsunami, soon we won't have to live like this, and Gato will no longer be able to ruin our lives." Tsunami said, "I know and I want that, but do you have to do this? Isn't already enough that you're trying to build the bridge? Why can't we send someone else?" In an emotionally charged tone. Gato, that vile man, had already cost her a great deal. She did not want to lose her father as well. "No, Tsunami, I started this and I will do all I can to help out my village. If that means risking my life to go to Konoha, then so be it." The elderly bridge builder simply shook his head. "That will no longer be necessary, Tazuna-san." The father and daughter turned quickly, staring fearfully at the massive figure that had entered their house without their knowledge. They were afraid that Gato had paid this individual to remove Tazuna because of the cloak that obscured their identity and the mosque's almost eerie appearance. Before blindly running at the figure, Tazuna turned and snatched up a knife, which allowed his daughter enough time to flee with his grandson Inari. The figure then calmly took Tazuna's wrist and removed the knife from his grasp with the other hand. With their assassin holding the knife he had previously used, Tazuna was sent into a nearby area by a palm strike. "I am not here to kill you, Tazuna-san, nor was I hired by Gato. In fact, I was sent here on a mission from the Hokage to eliminate Gato," was the next shocking statement that was spoken to the two. Tazuna and Tsunami were stunned to learn that Konoha had taken the initiative to resolve their issue for them, and for a while, neither side spoke. With tears at the corners of her eyes, Tsunami questioned, "Wait, so Gato is to be killed?" "No, you cannot kill someone who is already dead, right?" Naruto asked, turning to face the woman and giving her a little fright as his glowing eyes looked at her from behind his mask. You mean Gato is dead? Tazuna asked, her eyes widening even more. Naruto merely gave a nod with tears streaming down her face. Tsunami fell to her knees and covered her mouth with her hands. This enigmatic figure had destroyed the source of all their pain and suffering, and for a brief moment, it seemed too good to be true. Furthermore, he had unintentionally prevented her father from dying while on a pointless errand. When Tazuna learned of Gato's passing, he was so shocked that all he could do was sit on his ass and try to take it all in by staring off into the distance. He and his family would no longer have to make do with whatever they could find. He would no longer be concerned about his life being in jeopardy. His fellow villagers would no longer have to make do with rags in the streets. Naruto removed the scroll from one of the seals concealed inside his cloak. After observing their silence, he unfolded it and opened the bags of valuables that Gato had hidden inside his enormous vault, along with the stack of papers. Tazuna and Tsunami's eyes widened at what they saw. Part of my mission was to also liberate all of this from Gato and see to it that it was returned to its rightful owners, the denizens of Wave. Stunned by everything that had happened throughout the day, Gato questioned, Why? Why has your Hokage done all of this for us? A few of our scouts and merchants have seen the poor state you were in, and so the Hokage saw it fitting that we step in with Kiri too involved in its own troubles. He only asked that in return for doing so that you allow our shinobi, merchants, and other citizens free pass through your land and the use of your bridge when it is done. He also wishes that you seek out a trade treaty with our village when you have gotten back on your feet, Naruto said in a serious voice. Even though he truly didn't want to, he had to act as though he was still on duty because he was a kind of ambassador for Konoha. He simply wasn't good at being so almost robotic and emotionless. He was Naruto, the impulsive blonde with a cruel sense of humor. He was still Naruto, even though his training and lessons from the Sandaime had made him much calmer. However, he was aware that this was no longer the case when he put on his mask. He was the Hokage's sword and shield while wearing the mask. However, he wished he could at least express some feeling to these individuals, let them know that he sympathized with them and understood what it was like to be rescued from an apparently hopeless circumstance by an enigmatic person with an unidentified purpose. However, the expressions of joy and appreciation that the two adults were giving him would have to do. Tazuna shocked Naruto by getting on his hands and knees and saying, Of course. We will make sure that as soon as the bridge is done and we are financially stable that Konoha receives the thanks it deserves for saving us. But I must say this to you. Thank you. I don't know who you are nor do I care. Not only have you saved me and my family, but you've also ensured that my village is free of Gato's filthy grip. There is nothing that I or anyone here can do that would show you just how grateful we are for what you have done for us. A little taken aback by the expression of such gratitude, Naruto simply nodded his head and said, I was only completing my mission, though I must admit, taking out Gato is one kill I will never regret. When Tazuna stood up, he was startled to see nothing but his home's living room. When he looked up, their enigmatic savior appeared to have vanished as swiftly and silently as he had appeared. Nevertheless, the image of the mask and the expression of the man who had rescued them from their awful fate would live on in their memories forever, despite their brief interactions. We have to tell the rest of the village, said Tazuna, grinning as he turned to face his daughter. Yes, we do too, San, she said, nodding with a tearful smile. Naruto gazed at the enormous body of water, one of the numerous natural barriers that had made Uzushiogakure village hidden by whirling tides, so nearly impenetrable. The fierce whirlpools that gave Uzu its name would then need to be navigated by those who managed to cross the vast body of water. If they succeeded in doing so, whatever was left of their forces would have to contend with a village full of shinobi, who are renowned for their skill in fuinjutsu and their nearly ferocious fighting style. And right before the Third Shinobi World War began, Kumo, Iwa, and Kiri's combined forces had accomplished just that. The much smaller hidden village was destroyed by the combined power of 3 of the 5 great hidden villages, but not before the other villages suffered severe losses. During the battle's siege, Uzushio's own Azukage had wounded both Kiri and Kumo, resulting in their deaths. Additionally, they had lost several soldiers trying to reach the village, and they suffered further losses when Uzu's shinobi retaliated to protect their residents. Despite successfully destroying the village, the 3 villages had fallen short of their main objective. Naruto is evidence that the Uzumaki clan had not been entirely wiped out, even though their numbers had decreased. Although his mother, Kushina, had been a full-blooded Uzumaki, he was not. She was also among the numerous people who had escaped Uzu's devastation. Indeed, even though Iwa, Kumo, and Kiri were able to demolish Uzushio's buildings, the village's center, the Uzumaki clan continued to exist, albeit dispersed throughout the elemental nations. When the outsider appeared next to him and joined the blonde in staring out at the horizon as it glistened with the light of the moon and stars, Naruto was only mildly taken aback. Interesting how several of history's greatest villages and civilizations have risen from this piece of land. It seems this place is to be the origin of those who would go on to make a great impact on the world around them. For the better or worse, it is here you have started on doing so, just like those before you as well. You have slayed the tyrant Gato and freed this place of his power, cementing yourself as a hero to them. The question remains, will you become the same symbol of hope and peace to the rest of the world, or the villain who brought chaos to it? I will be both. My precious people will stand behind me as I use this sword and mask to defend them. My enemies will know me as the thing that goes bump in the night. That is what I aim to be. If they so happen to call me a hero or Jillian, then oh well, I've been called worse after all, Naruto said, removing his mask as he felt cheeky and fed up with the one-sided conversations he had with the outsider. He was looking directly into the outsider's eyes, which were twin pools of endless blackness. The blonde, who had gazed at him with neither fear nor respect, something wholly unfamiliar to the man, was the object of the outsider's attention. The otherworldly entity that had branded him had even made Corvo a little afraid. You are indeed very interesting, young Uzumaki. You are turning out to be quite the source of entertainment in exchange for entertaining me. I will say this. The line between the Uzumaki clan and those of the Itano and Kaldwin line has been blurred in the past. It is no coincidence that the Uzumaki inherited the powers. They did also know that while you were the first to gain my mark in millennia, you were not the last. The outsider vanished back into the void to do whatever a creature like him did before Naruto could say anything. What on earth was he trying to say? Were Corvo and Emily related to the Uzumaki? However, how? And to whom else might he have given the mark? Oh no. With an angry expression on his face, Naruto thought, this is just way too damn complicated, Tibeo. I have a feeling that the only way I can get some answers is if I go to Uzoshio, but I can't make the trip now, way too far to waterwalk, and it's not like there's a bunch of boats available either. Just freaking great. He sighed and refocused his attention on the horizon, the sky growing a little lighter as the moon started to set and the sun started its journey upward. After a rather drawn out and frustrating mission, Naruto put his mask back on and blurred away, taking one final glance back at the horizon before leaving for home. When he returned, he would have a mission report to deliver to the Sandaime. I'm gonna need some ramen after this. A few weeks had passed since Naruto's mission to Wave, and the Sandaime had allowed him some time off from missions to acclimate to both his new abilities and toys. The young blonde had only needed a few days to become used to Corvo's blade and the enhancements made to the already remarkable blade by Jinchuriki's tenant. Even Sarutobi would confess that the vulpine grin and general appearance of the new mask made him uneasy. He was still a little taken aback by Naruto's incredible rate of growth. He had been the boy's personal trainer for a while, so he had seen this firsthand. But even so, Naruto's rate of growth was astounding. The blonde Uzumaki was rapidly gaining experience and maturity. Though these were still areas he could improve, he ensured that by serving as the Hokage's right hand and avoiding D-rank missions. The old Kage was somewhat concerned that Naruto was following Itachi's path, but he felt more at ease after witnessing Naruto's behavior when he wasn't on duty. Even though the majesty of his pranks had subsided since he got his current job, Naruto behaved like any other 10-year-old without the mask, playing silly and still getting into trouble. Naruto, on the other hand, had no trouble using his training when he pulled practical jokes. Hiruzen felt secure in his choice to assign the young Uzumaki his next mission because he knew that Naruto was still Naruto and that the burdens of his job, his status as a Jinchuriki, and everything else life had thrown at him were not stealing the boy's happiness or identity. Naruto-kun, what do you remember about my students, the Sannin? The scene in front of Naruto left him with nothing to do but stare in frustration. He was outside one of the most well-known hot springs in Konoha when he saw what was likely one of the strongest ninja the city had ever produced, giggling as he peered into the spring. Naruto pondered, I wonder if Konoha is just plain weird, or if any of the other shinobi villages are like this. Based on his knowledge of the man in front of him and what the Sandaime had told him, he would need to take drastic measures to get the man's attention. With that in mind, Naruto's prankster side emerged, accompanied by a vulpine and extremely mischievous grin. A technique typically taught to Anbu. The young blonde used his skills to sneak up on the white-haired man and send chakra into his vocal cords to change his voice to a much more feminine pitch and amplify it. Eek! Peeping Tom! Naruto exclaimed, opening his mouth wide as he took a breath. The pervert leapt high into the air, as if someone had set fire to his ass. Startled by the volume of the yell, naturally, he had been bending forward, which allowed him to push himself over the walls of the hot spring and into the women's area. Shortly afterward, the spring started to emit very girly cries of pain, accompanied by declarations of hentai. In the meantime, the sounds of righteous feminine fury coming from behind the wooden fence made the Jinchuriki prankster laugh uncontrollably. He hadn't pulled off a large-scale prank in a long time, and defeating a ninja of that caliber was undoubtedly going to fall into his book of awesome and kick-ass pranks, patent pending. Like a group of carnivores who have just finished eating the carcass of a lesser animal, the women who had occupied the spring threw the motionless body over the wall after they had finished exacting payment on the pervert's body. When Anko of all people peered over the wall to see who had permitted them to apprehend and punish the pervert, Naruto was a little taken aback, wearing only a white towel, which did little to hide the curves that had earned her the title of one of Konoha's sexiest kunoichi. She smiled as she saw the familiar mop of blonde spikes and hopped the fence with ease. Well, if it isn't my favorite blonde, I can only guess it was you who gave us that lovely present? With his mind straining to process the very alluring scene in front of him, Naruto could only nod. Even though Anko wore rather risque clothing every day, it was nothing compared to the amount of skin that is currently on display. Naturally, Anko noticed and was too pleased to cross her arms, highlighting her already large bust and making Naruto's face flushed from the blood rushing to it in a lower area of his body. During the latter part of his training with her and the other Junin, he began to go through puberty, a process that changes both his body and his life naturally. The Sandaime was in charge of giving the young blonde the dreaded talk, since it was the closest thing the boy had to family. Naruto found it difficult to look at Kurenai or Anko after that specific lesson without turning into a human tomato. Being the person she was, Anko had seized nearly every chance to make fun of the unfortunate blonde, but Naruto couldn't do anything too X-rated because she was still only 10 years old. "Oh, thank you, Naru-kun, for saving me from that ghastly pervert," she said, sauntering up to the still heavily red Uzumaki, pushing his whiskered face into her ample cleavage and shaking him. Naruto attempted to respond, but two specific, fleshy pillows kept him from doing so when he discovered that Anko's sweater puppies were not only preventing him from speaking, they were also preventing him from breathing in oxygen, which was a problem. He became terrified when he realized he would die a very fleshy and perverted death if Anko didn't stop thanking him. Kurenai Yuhi, Anko's best friend and another of his Junin teachers, was fortunate enough to be his savior. The red-eyed beauty remarked, "Anko, Naruto doesn't look too good," as she sighed at her friend's antics. When Anko looked down, she saw Naruto struggling to break free from her bosom's grip. Sweat dropping, she released the young killer so he could gasp for air. Anko chose to intensify it after Naruto had refilled his lungs with oxygen. She put her toned arms around him from behind and whispered into his ears, making him shudder. "Hey Naru-kun, maybe when you're a little older I can show you how thankful I really am." Naruto sputtered, the blood threatening to burst from his head. Anko laughed, then gave the blonde Uzumaki's whiskered cheek a startlingly tender kiss before swaying away to her voluptuous hips, leaving Naruto, who was still very red, staring in disbelief once again. The purple-haired Tokubetsu Junin, Special Junin, leapt over the hot spring fence, her towel revealing the tiniest glimpse of her flawlessly formed rear end. Naruto stood there for a while, still trying to process what had happened to him naturally, when the man from before bowed himself at the blonde's feet and exclaimed, "I am not worthy. Teach me your ways, young master." He was startled out of his confused reverie. With a simple face palm, Naruto said, "Get up, you old perv. I am no regular pervert. When the ladies hear my name they shiver in anticipation, babies smile at my presence, and men bow at my feet, for I am." The man said as he immediately stood up, revealing himself to be a towering 6-foot-something wearing a green kimono with a red haori over it. In a monotone, Naruto concluded, "Jiraiya, one of the Densetsu no Sanin, 3 legendary ninja, and renowned sage of Myobokuzan, Mysterious Tree Mountain." Jiraiya was just grinning. Good to see the youth of today take the time to learn about their betters. "So what's your name, Gaki, brat?" With narrowed eyes and crossed arms, Naruto said, "Cut the crap, perv, you know my name. If you didn't you'd be an even poorer Kyufu, godfather, than I thought." He said, "So the Sandaime told you? I'm surprised. I thought he was going to wait until you were a ninja to tell you the truth of your heritage." The man's face lost all pretense of humor and assumed a decidedly serious expression. Naruto did not say anything. Plans changed. "I ended up not joining the Shinobi Corps and instead was chosen for another occupation, which led to me being told about my heritage among other things at an early age." "Other occupation? And what exactly is that occupation?" Jiraiya asked, her gray eyes narrowing. Naruto didn't say anything. "Out in public isn't exactly the best place to be talking about all this. Besides, Gigi wanted me to bring you to the office. He's got some stuff to talk to you about." Seeing the outsider's mark glowing, Naruto turned and grinned as he extended his hand and muttered, "Blink." Jiraiya watched in horror as his godson vanished in an instant, leaving behind an almost familiar trail of light. No. Was the Hiraishin, flying thunder god, used by the Gaki? "Come on, Ero Sennin, perverted hermit. Gonna let your 10-year-old godson beat you in a race?" Naruto asked. turning to face the Sannin with the same smile. Jiraiya shook his head and then leapt off toward the Hokage Tower at a comparatively rapid pace as Naruto took off in yet another blink before he could respond. Gaki may have his father's appearance, but he definitely inherited his mother's sly demeanor. One of the most feared ninja in all of the elemental countries used to be the Sandaime Hokage. It only made sense because Nin was a student of both the Shodaime and Nidaime Hokages, and because of their immense power, they could easily change the environment around them. Kami no Shinobi, the nickname his teachers had given him, was aptly applied to the Sandaime himself. Even though he didn't have a strong Kekai Genkai like his teachers or some other cages, he more than made up for it with an extensive collection of jutsu and the insight and understanding to know how to use it most efficiently. He had survived not one, not two, but all three of the Shinobi World Wars thanks to this very knowledge and wisdom, and he had earned the nickname, the Professor, for leading Konoha through two of them as its Hokage. The legendary power of his three students, the feared Densetsu no Sannin, only added to his already impressive list of accolades. He was still more than capable of holding his own against shinobi who were much younger than him. Despite his advanced age, he was now a man who had lived a long life. Far too long a life. In spite of everything, the power, the acclaim, the praise, he had outlived the Undaime Hokage, his successor, and other notable nin who, in his opinion, ought to have lived much longer. He had once been prepared to give the hat and robes to Tsukumo Hitaki, the Konoha no Shiroi Kiba, White Fang of Konoha, a powerful shinobi who was occasionally regarded as an unofficial fourth member of the Sannin. Naturally, the man had committed suicide in seppuku following a mission gone terribly wrong. Minato Namikaze, the first shinobi to ever achieve an SS ranking in the bingo book of two other villages, rescued him from his duties. For a brief moment he had thought to enjoy his retirement, serving merely as the bright young man's political advisor. Then tragedy again struck, this time in the form of the feared Kyuubi no Kitsune. Minato had given his life to save his village. Dying a true Hokage's death, Hiruzen had been compelled to assume his role as Kage again since there was no suitable replacement. Next was Itachi. The Uchiha clan's prodigy. Itachi was an astonishingly intelligent and powerful young man reaching the status of Enbu captain at the age of 13, beating out Kakashi Hitaki's previously held record of 15. For a while it seemed that Itachi was poised to take over and become Godem when he aged a little more. That was also not going to happen. Itachi disclosed that a violent uprising against their village was being planned by his family, the Uchiha clan, one of Konoha's founding clans. The promising teen had taken it upon himself and slaughtered near the entirety of his clansmen in one grisly night, sparing only his younger brother Sasuke. Itachi was forced to leave the village as a S-rank missing nin because he did not want to learn that a Kage had ordered the extermination of an entire clan. Sarutobi Hiruzen was sitting in front of his pseudo-grandson and student Jiraiya. He was a weary old man who wanted nothing more than to relax and spend what little time he had left with his family, something that had eluded him for nearly his entire life. Why would you think training a fucking 8-year-old to be a bloody assassin was a good idea? An 8-year-old Jinchuriki at that. What would Kushina and Minato say? Jiraiya yelled at his previous sensei. Hiruzen had to force himself not to laugh. If Kushina could return, she would most likely use those chakra chains to tear him to pieces after deep frying his ass. Kushina did not prioritize the village over herself and her family, but Minato did know. She was a full-blooded Uzumaki who was adamant that family and loved ones came first. That's why she used her chakra chains to bind that same Biju down even after giving birth and having the Kyuubi taken from her in order to save her newborn son. She still had the reflexes and motivation to put herself in the path of one of Kyuubi's enormous claws despite everything. Hiruzen was still unable to speak to his pupil. He had no excuse for training young Naruto to be the ideal assassin. Jiraiya angrily yelled, "You lied to me, Sensei. You told me he was taken care of, that he was enjoying a normal childhood. Why does my 10-year-old godson stand before me with the look of a veteran shinobi in his eyes and hands stained in blood? Give me one good reason I shouldn't send you into the belly of one of my toads." He was clearly holding back from attacking the elderly man, Hokage or not. Jiraiya had every right to feel this way about the boy. Even though some might find it strange, Jiraiya and Minato became the closest thing to father and son they could be without being blood relatives because Jiraiya had never had children of his own and Minato was an orphan by all rights. Jiraiya became Minato's father and legal guardian when he hired him as an apprentice. This implied that Naruto was also his grandson, a fact that even Kushina had accepted. He had trusted his sensei to take care of his godson and provide all the necessities for a child, something he was unable to do for Naruto because his job required him to travel throughout the world to places and circumstances unsuitable for children. It seemed that Naruto had been given the wrong end of the stick because that trust had been misplaced. I cannot what I have done to Naruto through both my actions and inactions cannot be justified, the lies I told you and Tsunade cannot be taken back, Hiruzen said while bowing his head. When the slug princess Tsunade Senju, another Sannin, was mentioned, Naruto's eyes narrowed. Why would you lie to Tsunade? Why should she care about me? If it were possible, Sarutobi flinched and Jiraiya became even more irate. Gaki, she should care about you because your mother named her as your godmother. The question remains now, why would Sensei not tell you this when he was so eager to tell you about everything else? At that, Naruto's eyes grew wide. He believed for years that his whole family had left him at the orphanage. He was both ecstatic and extremely saddened to learn the truth about what had actually happened to his parents. His parents did not desert him because they loved him. He was initially upset to learn that Jiraiya was his godfather, but he soon moved on because, as cynical as that idea was, he knew that older shinobi had more important things to do than fret about some brat. He was now learning that this was untrue in actuality. Jiraiya had left him because he believed he would be looked after by competent and caring people rather than simply to avoid dealing with a child. That was obviously not the case. Then there was Tsunade Senju, whom he believed to be nothing more than a distant relative because they were related to Mito Uzumaki. Apparently, that was not the whole truth, or at least not the truth in reality. She was his godmother and not just a distant cousin. The reason she hadn't supported him was related to the Sandaime, the man he and nearly everyone else thought they could trust. The cage appeared to have practically spat on that trust. You knowingly show your whole hand to a man who still hides several cards from you. The outsider's words replayed in his mind, and why? It was only now that he understood the outsider's exact meaning in that remark. Naruto had assumed that the outsider had been discussing the entire situation after learning about his parents and his fuzzy tenant. But he now realizes that was untrue. This, and perhaps much more, was what the supernatural creature had been hinting at. For a brief moment, there was no sound, and the group was enveloped in a gloomy silence. Jiraiya was trying to collect himself. Hiruzen was too preoccupied with his own reflections on his numerous failures throughout his life, and Naruto appeared to have gone into shock. Why? The two elder nin had to give themselves some time to realize that anything had even been said because the sound was so abrupt and soft. Eventually Sarutobi replied with a glossed-over gaze, "At first it was because of my duty to the village. I felt that it was only the right thing to do. I couldn't afford to have the heir of our two strongest shinobi and Jinchuriki just be a normal civilian. You were far too precious as a weapon to allow that to happen. Eventually, over the course of teaching you, I finally realized that I had become my teammate, a notion he himself picked up on. I was ashamed of what I had done. That's why I want you to go on this last mission for me. This mission is the only way I can think of to repent to not just you but to all those involved in this mess I made." "And what exactly is this mission that you think can fix everything?" Jiraiya asked after Naruto remained silent. Hiruzen did not say anything. "Not fix. I know what I have done can in no way be fixed. I can only hope to make things somewhat better." With a sigh, Sarutobi continued. "My last mission for you, Naruto, is to go on a training trip with Jiraiya as your teacher. During this trip you will track down Tsunade and convince her to come back to the village to become the Godem Hokage, 5th Fire Shadow." Jiraiya glanced at Naruto before focusing on his sensei's figure. From his early days as a gullible group of genin with Tsunade and Orochimaru, he had carried with him the belief that his sensei was infallible. Naturally, as an adult, he had come to understand that his sensei was fundamentally a man. Just like him and any other civilian or bandit, he still believed that Sarutobi was far superior to most men because of his wisdom, strength, and experience, which were the characteristics that made him who he was. It was only now that he saw the folly of that. Sarutobi had, in the past, been a formidable force in both politics and combat, but that same man, who had trained him and his teammates to become formidable shinobi in their own right, was not present before him. No, a worn-out, elderly man who had lived far too long sat in front of him. A man sat here who had lost 2 children to war many years ago and his wife to tragedy 10 years ago. His favorite student, Orochimaru, had started to walk down the dark and twisted path, but he had chosen to ignore it until it was too late. Hiruzen's motivation for sending him and Naruto to locate Tsunade was now evident. He was aware that he had spent too much time in that chair when Minato took the hat. He ought to have finished. But destiny had other ideas. Sarutobi Hiruzen was physically and mentally unfit to serve as Hokage Konoha as needed. Jiraiya nodded and said, "We'll go. It will take some time to track and find Tsunade, let alone convince her to come back to the place she believes took everything from her." Sarutobi replied, "I can only hope that having Naruto with you will help convince her to come back." As he turned around and approached Naruto, Jiraiya glanced at his sensei and said, "You know she won't be happy with you or this village when she finds out what happened to her godson. Kushina may not be here to do it, but Tsunade will be all too happy to take her place, and I have no intentions of stopping her." Without saying another word, Jiraiya placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder. They then left, leaving Hiruzen alone, or so they believed, after a silent shunshin. I presume you enjoyed the show Danzo? The Leaf's own Warhawk, Shimura Danzo, appeared in the shadows in a bandaged form. I will admit seeing you get chewed out by your student was amusing. However, do you think it is the right decision to name Tsunade as your successor? She will do what I can no longer do and wrestle power back from the civilians and change things for the better. Naruto may be her only motivation, but the results will be more than worth it, Sarutobi said, turning to face the enormous faces of the 4 Hokages carved into the side of a mountain outside his window. It would do us good to have someone like her sitting on the chair. The stubbornness she gets from her Uzumaki blood will be a boon to her in this village, said Danzo. The Sandaime expressed a little surprise when Danzo said, I would not think you would be on board with this decision. The bandaged advisor used one of his good eyes to look at his former colleague. While many think me a stubborn old warmonger, my end goal has always been the betterment of this village. The current level of power the civilians have on the council and across the village does not coincide with that. They have made this village and its shinobi weak in the long run. Neither you or I can do much of anything else in these weak bodies of ours. The days of our generation are gone. We have overstayed our welcome. It is now time for a new generation to take the reins. A change is coming, and I have a feeling that Naruto will be playing a very important role in it all, Hiruzen said after the two men sat in silence for a while. Danzo gave a nod. That boy will change things. That is for sure. All we can do is prepare the young ones for what may come and make sure they do not make the same mistakes we made. The time for change was drawing near. The board was being set, and important players were already emerging for them and their like. The only thing left to do was to watch it all unfold. As they left Konoha at a steady pace, Naruto said, So where are we headed to first? Aro Kyufu. He had needed some much-needed time to reflect. During the time it had taken him to pack and gather his belongings for the long mission, he was undoubtedly furious about what the old cage had done, but for the time being he had more important things to attend to, specifically, bringing his surviving family back together. What it is with you Uzumakis and giving me stupid nicknames? Jiraiya asked, her eye twitching. Says the guy who calls himself a super pervert, Naruto said, raising only an eyebrow. The young blonde was all Jiraiya could do but glare at her. He continued by pinching the bridge of his nose. The hardest part of this mission is going to be tracking Tsunade down. She never stays in one place for too long, so picking up on any sort of trail she may leave is going to be difficult. Only thing that makes it easier is that she's an avid gambler and drunk, which means she'll probably be in a town with a bar and casino. Naruto was shaking his head. Are all-powerful ninja messed up in the head? I mean, you're a perv. She's an alcoholic gambler, Orochimaru as well. Orochimaru. And the Sandaime is a closet perv. And what, you're saying you're normal? Jiraiya asked with a sly smile. I've got a thousands-of-year-old manifestation of chakra in my gut. Normal was never going to be a possibility for me, Naruto said, glaring at the older nin. The remark, hey, it could be worse. Gaki, your mom used to have this weird obsession with ramen and a verbal tick, made Jiraiya laugh. The blonde assassin's expression humorously changed to one of rage, saying, don't diss the ramen tebayo. The toad sage started laughing so hard that tears started to fall down his cheeks, forcing him to grip at his sides. Naruto simply pouted bitterly. Oh man, you really are Kushina's kid. When his godfather unintentionally complimented him, the blonde Uzumaki grinned broadly. It made sense given the type of people his parents had been. When people made comparisons between him and his mother, the younger half of Uzumaki particularly enjoyed it. Although Naruto respected his father, he was a little resentful of him because of the cage's choice to prioritize the needs of the village over those of his newborn. But his mother was another story. The tales Kakashi had told him about the Uzumaki heiress, along with what little he could learn from his brief stay at his parents' house, painted a picture of a kunoichi who was both strong and attractive, with a short fuse to match. He was frequently informed that while his father had given him his appearance, his mother had given him nearly everything else. For a while, the two nin traveled in comparatively quiet conditions. Jiraiya's thoughts were rapidly going over everything that had happened. While Naruto was taking in the scenery, he discovered that his godson was not as safe as he had been told, as well as the condition of his sensei, whom he had admired since he was a young boy, and the quest he and his godson were on to locate his ex-teammate. Hey Gaki, Sarutobi didn't tell me about what you can do. What exactly were you trained in? He asked Naruto, hastily deciding that he would have time for his personal feelings later. Naruto simply replied, Sarutobi taught me history, strategy, and the basics of chakra. I learned some jutsu from Kakashi ni. Gai-sensei helped me learn some basic taijutsu, Enko-chan taught me about poisons, and Kurenai-sensei taught me how to break genjutsu. Well, I guess I'll help you with your birthrights then, Jiraiya said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. In his hands, The toad sage conjured a baseball-sized swirling ball of chakra while grinning like a child. The sage went on. This Gaki is the... with a particularly proud expression. Rasengan. Jiraiya could only gape at his blonde apprentice. The 10-year-old blonde had a perfectly formed ball of self-sustaining chakra in her palm. A boy who was just beginning puberty possessed a jutsu that had taken 3 years to develop and 3 months for him, one of the Densetsu no Sanin, to master. How who? The Sandame figured I should learn my father's jutsu, so he let me into the Namikaze house so I could grab the jutsu scroll and learn. It took me about a week to get it down, said the blonde Uzumaki, with a cheeky smile directed at his godfather. There was silence between them. With a curious expression on his face, Naruto said, "My godfather is too shocked to say or do much." In a move that is widely referred to as the facepalm, Jiraiya emerged from his daze and placed his palm on his face. Soon after, there were murmurs that vaguely sounded like, "Fucking Uzumaki, stupid blondes, damn Gaki." Infuriated, Jiraiya pinched the bridge of his nose and went on, "Please tell me you're not also a damn Fuinjutsu master as well." "Nope, so far all I can do is make storage seals and minor explosive tags," Naruto said, fighting the urge to laugh at the childish way the elder shinobi was behaving. "Well, alright then, for now we're gonna have to cover a lot of ground to meet up with some of my informants to see if we can get a trail on Tsunade. During that time I want you working on seals. I'll help when I can, but I can't guarantee I'll always be there with you. In fact, you may be on your own quite a bit, as I do business that isn't exactly the best place for a 10-year-old, regardless of your profession." Naruto nodded, curious about the art that his mother's family was notorious for. It was actually claimed that both of his parents were sealing masters, with his mother being superior because of her Uzumaki ancestry. The Uzumaki's chakra and minds, for some reason, enabled them to comprehend the complexities of the art far more quickly than the typical mind. Their seals were far more resilient and powerful than usual because of their strong chakra. "Gaki, have you tried using your tenant's chakra?" Jiraiya said in a commanding tone. Known as Konoha no Benihime, the crimson, bloody princess of Konoha, Kushina was a formidable kunoichi in her own right, but she transformed into a crimson storm of death and destruction when she tapped into the Kyuubi's reserves. But only the bare minimum of the Bijuu's chakra had entered her body due to her seal. Even though Naruto's seal kept the beast at bay just as well, it let a lot more of the powerful chakra into his body. Since he was born with the enormous construct of chakra, he would have the ability to access a greater amount of it without fear of adverse effects. He would eventually be able to perform the skill that other Jinchuriki had acquired, perfect synchronization with their Biju. As he grew older, a ninja would be extremely intimidating if they had the dreaded Kyuubi no Kitsune's power behind them. With the Kyuubi's power behind them, an Uzumaki and the son of one of the most dreaded ninja to have ever set foot on Earth, Naruto might surpass the likes of Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha, 2 male monsters who have destroyed armies on their own. With that much potential, hell, the blonde might be able to summon the strength of the Rakuduo Sennin, Sage of 6 Paths, the renowned inventor of the shinobi method. Naruto said, "No, and I don't intend to anytime soon," with all the 10-year-old's defiance and determination. This statement rightfully shocked Jiraiya, who exclaimed, "What do you mean, Gaki? Who among the ninja would refuse the chance to wield such power?" His ex-teammate had gone rogue in order to possess even a small amount of the power Naruto might possess. "I don't want to rely on the fox's power as it is. I already have the powers I get from the outsider's mark, so why would I need to use its power?" This statement piqued Jiraiya's interest. With the help of the strongest Biju, what could the blonde refuse to accept as an outsider's mark? "I heard you and Sarutobi say something about a mark, but what the hell is it to have warranted him turning you into an assassin?" the man with gray hair inquired. With his back to Jiraiya, Naruto merely held up his hand. Jiraiya was genuinely unable to comprehend what he saw on the back of his godson's hand. There were a number of intricately overlapping marks that formed a shape Jiraiya could only describe as resembling an archer's bow. It perplexed Jiraiya, a master of Fuinjutsu whose skills were only surpassed by those of long-dead people. The glyphs in front of Naruto were more intricate than even the seal that contained the 9-tailed fox. Even though Minato had invoked the god of death himself to help apply the Hake no Fuin Shiki, 8 trigram seal, he was still able to understand the fundamentals and understand what the seal was doing, even though he didn't fully comprehend every detail. But Naruto was stunned by this mark on his hand. Most people would have thought the mark was just an elaborate tattoo, but Jiraiya saw right through that. As a matter of fact, the mark's black lines were actually made up of countless smaller seals. The odd thing was that there were areas where there were no seals and only black lines of ink or whatever material had been used to make the mark. He could only surmise that these were either strategically positioned or intended to confuse anyone attempting to replicate the seal. "Gaki, what in the world did you get involved in?" Jiraiya pondered in his mind. "What exactly does this mark do?" he asked his new apprentice after shaking his head. Naruto briefly entertained the idea of deceiving Jiraiya. This man was his godfather, it was true, but he had told the Sandaime almost every secret he knew, and look where that had led him. Only the Sannin could claim that he had been trained by the man known as the Professor across the nations, but for what purpose? In order for him to serve as a useful little weapon for a village that disregarded him and treated him like dirt. An alien creature who viewed Naruto as merely a source of amusement was the only one who had never lied to him. That way, at least, he never questioned the outsider's intentions. Why would he need to tell Naruto a lie? It was much more entertaining, according to the outsider, to watch him accept the truth rather than believe a lie. The man in front of him wasn't like that. The man in front of him was not his godfather. In fact, aside from a few legal documents, he had no relationship with the man. And to a shinobi, what did legal documents mean? Shinobi who were professional murderers, thieves, and liars. Naruto's practical side, which had enabled him to endure his unpleasant life in the village, made a valid point despite the negative thoughts racing through his mind. What was the point? He was already on his way to becoming the village's lethal weapon, which was what the Sandaime had desired. Furthermore, despite his silly demeanor, Jiraiya was an unmatched spymaster. Even though Naruto was a good boy, he could not possibly have lied to the mastermind of one of the biggest spy networks that covered almost all of the elemental countries at the age of 10. Naruto briefly relived the story he had told the outsider on the Nami shores all those days ago. I will be both. My precious people will stand behind me as I use this sword and mask to defend them. Naruto laughed bitterly and thought, what precious people? An elderly cage who considered me merely the village's weapon. Did my godfather desert me to that same cage? The faces of Naruto's teachers, with whom he had spent months upon months, revealed his obstinate and hopeful side. Anko and her jokes, her kind smile, and Kurenai Guy and his flames of youth are absurd and cockshy in the days they'd spent talking about nothing and everything. Did they truly want to assist me, as evidenced by their actions? Or was it simply another mission? Simply carrying out their Hokage's orders? Naruto appeared to have been deeply shaken by the revelation of the betrayal that had left him feeling isolated and shivering. As a child, he painted a picture of the world around him that was distinctly darker than what he had initially imagined, and that was saying something. Naruto reluctantly acknowledged that he was powerless to do much at this point. His fists clenched. This was not the moment for an epiphany or emotional breakdown for the time being. All he could do was express his desires to Jiraiya and, ideally, find time later to resolve his emotions. Naruto told Jiraiya what the blessing of the outsider allowed him to do while wearing a much more somber expression that only a seasoned shinobi should have. He described the powers, their limitations, and how he could get rid of or mitigate those flaws. Jiraiya was too preoccupied with thoughts of Naruto's potential, among other things, to notice that his godson had changed. The half-blood Uzumaki's brilliant sapphires were not as gleaming and mischievous as they usually were. Naruto's eyes stopped crinkling. The smile that could split his face had vanished. The expression was blank now. He wore this expression when he killed his feelings and concentrated only on the task at hand, a look no child of 10 should be able to pull off.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.